Sherlock Holmes and the Sign of the Silent Sister, an honoring audiobook's original story from the reminiscences of John H. Watson, M.D. Chapter 1, The Letter from Longar. It was in the second week of November, during a particularly bitter spell that had turned Baker Street into a corridor of chilled drafts and rattling panes, that Sherlock Holmes turned from the fireplace with a letter in his hand and a peculiar gleam in his eye, the kind that never failed to signal the beginning of another of his singular cases. I had just returned from a morning round at the Kensington Infirmary and was warming my hands over a cup of tea when Holmes, who had spent the better part of the morning alternately pacing and perusing a thick tome on early Christian symbology, finally broke his silence. "Watson," he said, waving the letter between two fingers as if it were a calling card from Mephistopheles himself, "have you ever heard of the Abbey of Longar in northern Wales?" I shook my head. "No, I can't say that I have. Is it of some antiquarian interest?" "More than that. It is an isolated monastic community, Benedictine in origin but deeply idiosyncratic in practice, cut off by both design and geography from the wider ecclesiastical structures of Britain. They took a vow of silent contemplation nearly 70 years ago. Only the abbot and the sister superior are permitted to speak, and even they do so sparingly." "And what connection," I asked, glancing at the fire, "has such a remote cloister to a man like you?" Holmes smiled thinly and handed me the letter. The paper was thick, cream-colored, flecked with what appeared to be dried blood, though Holmes would later confirm it was rust from the inkwell of its frantic author. The handwriting was spidery, uneven, and in a disordered scrawl across the page. "To whom this reaches, the silent one has broken her vow. There is blood in the chapel. She wrote before she vanished, just one word, Eternitas. We cannot explain. We dare not leave. Brother Cadwallader." I read the message again and again, struck more by what it concealed than what it revealed. "Where did this come from?" I asked. "It was delivered by hand, to our landlady no less, by a rail-thin novice in a patched woolen cloak who disappeared into the fog without offering a name or explanation. He came bearing this and nothing else." Holmes took the letter back, folding it with care. "There is something that reeks of the theatrical in this, Watson, and yet the detail of the vanished nun, the blood, and this cryptic Eternitas. No, I believe this warrants further inquiry. Do you intend to travel to Wales?" "I do. And you shall accompany me. Bring warm clothing and little else. We depart by the midnight train to Llangollen." We arrived in the slate-gray hills of northern Wales 2 days later, following a rain-battered journey by rail, then coach, and finally by foot. Our destination, the Abbey of Longar, lay nestled in a cleft between two glowering ridges, its moss-covered stone towers barely visible through the thick mist that clung to the mountainside like a shroud. From the moment we passed through its iron-wrought gates, unlocked, but groaning with the weight of centuries, I felt the place press in on us with an almost sentient gloom. We were greeted, if that word could be applied, by a grim-faced woman clad in a gray habit with a red thread stitched into the hem. She inclined her head slightly but said nothing, merely gestured that we should follow. Holmes, who had adopted the name Mr. Percival Ashe for the sake of discretion, kept his expression neutral, though I could see in his eyes the flickers of calculation. Every face we passed, novices and monks alike, was marked by an unnatural stillness. No one spoke. No one acknowledged us. It was as if we had stepped into a painting. In the refectory, after a silent meal of barley soup and coarse bread, Holmes and I were shown to our rooms. Mine was modest but clean. His was adjacent, overlooking the inner cloister. That night, as the wind howled through the rafters and the monastery bells tolled a hollow midnight, Holmes slipped into my room bearing a candle and a thin volume bound in cracked leather. "I've made an initial survey," he said, speaking in a whisper, though there was no one nearby to overhear. The nun who vanished, Sister Agatha, was mute by birth, and a recluse even among this peculiarly silent order. She tended the library and was one of the few permitted to copy and restore manuscripts. "Then, how did she write in blood?" I asked. "She had no formal education. She was taught to read Latin and Greek by the previous librarian. They say she communicated with signs. What I find more interesting is that her chambers are locked from the inside, and no one has had the courage to break the seal." What seal? Holmes handed me a piece of parchment. A broken wax seal, once bearing the impression of an ancient Benedictine crest. It was affixed by the abbot himself, I'm told. I shall pay him a visit tomorrow. In the meantime, I found this volume misfiled in the scriptorium, an early 15th century treatise on angelic hierarchies, copied by hand in a script known only to a few. He held up the page. In the margin, scrawled in blood-red ink, was the word Eternitas. The following morning, we were brought before Abbot Theodoric in a domed room with narrow lancet windows that bled gray light into the stone interior. He was a man of great age and sparse words, his face like carved driftwood, and his eyes pale and unblinking. "You are welcome here," he said slowly, with a voice like wind through dead leaves. "But you will not find answers where there are none." Holmes bowed slightly. "I seek only to understand what Sister Agatha wished to convey in her final act. This word, Eternitas, may suggest something beyond mere superstition." The abbot's lips twitched. "She broke her silence. That alone is cause for alarm." "She was mute," Holmes corrected gently. "She did not speak. She wrote." "A vow broken is a vow broken," the abbot replied, unmoved, "even if written in blood." Holmes turned slightly. "Then perhaps you can permit me access to her quarters." The abbot hesitated. "No man has stepped foot there since the seal was placed." "I am not a man of this house," Holmes said, "and perhaps it will take an outsider's eye to see what yours cannot." There was a long silence before the abbot finally gestured to a robed monk at the door. "Brother Owain will take you, but know this. To disturb the past is to awaken what was meant to sleep." Sister Agatha's chambers were located at the rear of the monastery, through a corridor little used and choked with dust. The air was colder here, and the scent of mildew clung to the walls. Brother Owain, a giant of a man with downcast eyes, produced an iron key from his sleeve and unlocked the heavy door. As it creaked open, I saw Holmes tense. Inside, the room was bare save for a small cot, a writing desk, and a crucifix above the narrow window. But it was the desk that drew Holmes's attention. On its surface, smeared across the wood, was the dried remains of what had once been blood, spelling out in shaky, looping letters, Eternitas. Holmes moved through the room with careful precision, examining the cot, the floorboards, and the ledge beneath the window. "She did not flee," he said. "There is no sign of struggle, but something drew her, perhaps a summons." He tapped the crucifix with a finger, then withdrew it to inspect the nails fastening it to the wall. "One of the nails is loose," he murmured. "Watson, lend me your penknife." With deft hands, Holmes pried the nail free and pulled the crucifix forward. Behind it, hidden in the hollow of the wall, was a folded page. He opened it carefully. The parchment was fragile, and the ink had faded to a ghostly brown, but it bore a diagram, concentric circles filled with runes, and at the center, the same sigil we had seen on the seal. Below it was a line of Latin, "Per silentium aeternitas," through silence, eternity. We exchanged a glance. "There is something here," Holmes whispered. "A theology, perhaps, or a ritual." But she knew she had discovered something forbidden. He turned the page over. There, in a second hand, more recent, were 2 words written hastily. "Look beneath." That night, as I wrote these words by candlelight, Holmes was already beneath the monastery, having located a hidden stairwell beneath the refectory, its entrance cleverly concealed beneath a loose flagstone. He beckoned me down in silence. We descended into a crypt lined with ossuaries, the bones of long-dead brothers stacked in silence around us. At the far end of the chamber stood a heavy iron door. Holmes held up the crucifix. Its nail now revealed to be a disguised key. He turned it in the lock. The door opened with a sigh, revealing a chamber lit by a single ever-burning lamp of ancient design. On a stone slab in the center lay a second habit, identical to that worn by the nuns above, but empty. Holmes stepped forward and turned to me with a look I had seen only twice before in our long career together. Awe. "She never left," he said. "She changed." And somewhere above us, the monastery bells began to ring, not in mourning nor in celebration, but in warning. Chapter 2. The Whispering Walls. The tolling of the bells that echoed through the ancient stone halls of Longar Abbey that night chilled my bones more than the subterranean damp ever could. It was not the solemn cadence of evening prayers, nor the sharp summons of alarm, but a strange, halting rhythm. 5 chimes, a pause, then 7. repeated but never resolved. Holmes stood unmoving in the chamber below, the false habit still draped across the slab between us, as the sound bled into the crypt like a distant voice. "Do you hear it?" he asked, his voice low. "Of course," I replied, glancing around. "The bell tower is active, but surely it must be one of the brothers." Holmes shook his head slowly. "I observed the ropes earlier. They have not been touched." We listened again. 5 chimes. Pause. 7. "What does it mean?" Holmes turned, candlelight flickering across his features. "Numbers are often messages in disguise, and at Langar, everything is disguised." He gestured for us to ascend the stairs once more, and I followed, heart thudding. We re-emerged into a hallway, veiled in dusk. The monastery, though no larger than a small estate, had acquired the labyrinthine sprawl of a place allowed to grow untended by time or rational planning. The wind outside howled more fiercely now, and the stone walls, lined with ancient Latin inscriptions, seemed to whisper back with groans and murmurs of their own. As we made our way down the hall, Holmes paused at one of the inlaid stones, running his hand across a frieze carved with monks kneeling before a circular symbol, identical to the one we had seen in the hidden manuscript. He said nothing but noted it in his journal. I knew that look. The rapid synthesis of clues, symbols, and anomalies only Holmes could hold in a single equation. Back in the safety of our chambers, he began to pace. "Tell me, Watson, what do you make of the message written in blood?" "Eternitas? A reference to eternity, surely. Perhaps she feared for her soul?" "Or perhaps," Holmes said, tapping his fingers against his brow, "she feared what eternity had become." He turned and snatched a thin codex from his satchel, the same one recovered from the scriptorium. Flipping rapidly, he located the margin where Eternitas was scrawled. "Here," he said, pointing. "And here again, this word appears in the margins of 4 different volumes, each time adjacent to diagrams resembling ancient hermetic circles or binding sigils. This is no ordinary marginalia. It is a trail." I took the book from him and turned a page. But what was she trying to find or protect? That is what we must discern. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the grounds glazed with frost. Holmes and I were invited, if that term could be generously used, by Sister Margaret, the prioress, to attend the morning recitation. Her eyes were ice, her mouth thin and pursed as if bound by steel thread. We entered the chapel, a vaulted stone chamber heavy with the scent of frankincense and thyme. No candles burned. The congregation of monks and nuns sat in rows, heads bowed in absolute stillness. There was no chanting, no prayer, only silence. Holmes leaned toward me and whispered, "They are listening." To what? But he only stared upward. I followed his gaze to the apse. There, woven into the tessellated stained glass, was a pattern I had not previously noticed, a double Ouroboros encircling a sigil of wings and flame. It was unnerving. When the silent recitation ended, the assembly stood, bowed in synchrony, and filed out. As we turned to leave, Holmes froze. There, standing in the shadows of a side alcove, was a figure. A nun. Her habit bore a faint red thread at the collar, like Sister Agatha's had in the written account, and though her face was turned away, her posture was unmistakable, tense, half-raised, as if in the act of listening. Holmes stepped forward. "Excuse me," but she vanished into the shadows like smoke. We followed down a narrow corridor lined with weather-worn frescoes of biblical scenes rendered with primitive zeal. At the far end, we found a locked wooden door marked Silentia. A whisper behind us stopped me cold. "Doctor." It was a woman's voice, soft, urgent, and unquestionably human. We turned, but the corridor was empty. Holmes raised a hand for silence and knelt by the door. "Fresh tracks," he murmured. "She came this way recently." "But who? Sister Agatha? Or someone who wants us to believe so?" Holmes retrieved a folded paper from his coat. The 2 words we found beneath the crucifix. Look beneath. They were not metaphorical. There is something more hidden in the monastery than mere passages and crypts. He placed his hand on the door. This room, Silentia, was once a chamber of penance. I suspect it is something else now. Later that afternoon, under the guise of assisting in the infirmary, I spoke with Brother Emrys, a sallow monk with sunken cheeks and trembling hands. He was one of the few permitted speech, though even that was sparse. "Sister Agatha?" I ventured gently. "Did you know her?" He hesitated, glanced over his shoulder, then nodded. "She was different," he whispered. Not mad, no, just listening to something the rest of us could not hear. She spent hours in the library with the old manuscripts. Did she speak to anyone? No, he said quickly. Not with words, but she would draw. Symbols. Circles. She believed something ancient was here, bound in silence as we are. He leaned in closer, voice trembling. Have you heard it? At night, the walls, they whisper. I remembered the groaning of the stone in the crypt and the strange rhythmic bells. What do they say? He shook his head. Not in language, in feeling, a pressure behind the eyes, a weight in the soul. At that moment, Sister Margaret appeared behind him and laid a single bony hand on his shoulder. He fell immediately silent and bowed. She looked at me with flint in her eyes. Brother Emrys is unwell. He requires rest. That evening, Holmes revealed what he had been working on during our hours apart. He had taken rubbings of the wall carvings and begun to assemble them into a sequence, a pictographic language of silence, death, and time. This, he said, pointing to one symbol, a spiral bisected by a line, is a visual shorthand for interruption. In several ancient monastic texts, it represents a break in the divine silence, a voice where none should be. He pointed to another. This symbol? A chalice with no bottom, a receptacle that cannot contain, meaning the eternal cannot be held. I believe Sister Agatha discovered an apocryphal gospel here, one not sanctioned by Rome. I frowned. You believe this is theological? Not in the sense you mean. Theology is often a mask for power. Control. Something ancient and dangerous was hidden in this abbey. Agatha found it, and someone silenced her for it. Or she was driven mad by it. Would a madwoman take such careful pains to leave clues? Hide messages in blood and code? She wasn't trying to escape. She was trying to warn us. Holmes paced to the window and looked out over the cloister. And now I must warn you, Watson. This will become far more dangerous than I originally believed. Have you made a decision? He nodded. Yes. Tomorrow I take on the robes of a brother. I will enter the restricted quarter, the sanctum. Won't they suspect? They suspect already, but suspicion is different from proof, and if they believe I am seeking penitence, they may let down their guard. And me, you must remain yourself, visible, curious, and irritant, while I vanish among the shadows. That night, I awoke to the sound of scratching, faint, deliberate. I lit a candle and turned toward the door. There, beneath the frame, a piece of parchment had been slipped into my room. I picked it up, heart pounding. In that same spidery hand I recognized from the first letter, it read, "The silence is a prison, but some learn to speak through the walls. She is not gone. She waits. Trust no one cloaked in gray." C. Holmes had said earlier that in Langar everything was disguised, but perhaps it was more accurate to say everything was a disguise. Chapter 3. The Library of Unheard Words. Holmes vanished at dawn. There was no announcement, no ceremony, only the quiet creak of the door and the faint scent of damp wool, as if the very stones of the monastery had swallowed him whole. When I rose and looked out into the cloister walk, there was no sign of him. Only Brother Allen raking dead leaves into the fog, his back hunched against the morning chill. Holmes had assumed the robes of a penitent brother and gone into the sanctum, the heart of Langar Abbey, sealed to all but the most trusted initiates. From the moment the ironwood door shut behind him, I felt the weight of this investigation fall fully upon my shoulders, and that is precisely, I suspect, what Holmes intended. For if they were watching us, and they were always watching, then his absence must serve as a sleight of hand. I would be the light to draw their eyes, while Holmes descended into the darker recesses, where ancient voices echoed behind stone and script. My day began in the Bibliotheca Vetusta, the so-called Old Library, which lay 2 levels below the main cloister in a chamber with ceilings so low I had to stoop. It smelled of parchment, mildew, and centuries. Brother Llewellyn, a scribe with cataracted eyes and fingers stained permanently with ink, had agreed, grudgingly, to let me catalog the more fragile volumes. He was ancient, nearly blind, and recited Latin verses under his breath as he worked, as though warding off whatever spirits might yet haunt the binding glue. As I passed row after row of vellum-bound tomes, I became acutely aware of how deeply insulated Langar Abbey was from the outside world. These were not merely theological works. Many bore no Latin titles at all. There were Celtic tracts, old Druidic inscriptions, treatises on pre-Christian mysticism, even one volume, bound in lambskin, that appeared to be a phonetic cipher keyed to an alphabet I did not recognize. Among these, I found a slender book, unmarked on the spine, bound in deep green leather. Its pages crackled as I opened it. Inside were diagrams, rings within rings, intersecting lines, notations in red ink that bore resemblance to Kabbalistic glyphs and early Pictish runes. In the margins, a signature I had seen before. Agatha. It was not a full name, only a lowercase a, followed by a curled flourish. I turned the page and felt the room darken. There in the center was the circular symbol from the scriptorium, twin Ouroboroi, enclosing a broken triangle, encircled by dots, 7 of them, like points on a sundial. Beneath, the same words scrawled in ink so deep it bled through the paper, Eternitas. And then a second message, faint and faded. The word is broken. The voice hides in the silence. Find the sister who sees but cannot speak? I heard a cough behind me and shut the book instinctively. Brother Llewellyn had drifted closer. That one? He rasped, pointing with a bent finger. You should not read that one. It belonged to her. Sister Agatha? He nodded slowly. She came often, sat in that corner, always with that book, talking to no one. Was she ever visited? Anyone who came to see her? He paused for a long time, as if struggling against a weight that pressed upon his memory. There was one, he said finally. A woman, not of the order, dressed in gray, never gave her name, came once a month. They never spoke, just sat. Do you know where she stayed? No one ever saw her arrive. No one saw her leave. The rest of the day passed in a haze of cold and parchment. I caught glimpses of shadows flitting behind columns, a flicker of robes around corners. Whether real or imagined, I could not tell. That night, the bells rang again. 5. Pause. 7. I waited in the chapel after the others had left. The only light was from the stained glass window in the apse, glowing faintly in the moonlight. I stared again at the twin Ouroboroi and thought of the strange message. The word is broken. Suddenly a sound behind me. Not a footstep, but a whisper. Paper sliding on stone. I turned and found a page tucked beneath the seat of the pew where Agatha was said to have sat. It had been torn from a notebook. In that same looping hand, the wall speaks on the 7th hour. Do not look with your eyes. Listen. At once I became aware of a low vibration, a pulse too deep to be heard, only felt. I pressed my hand to the stone bench, and for a moment I could swear I heard something. A voice, not in words, but rhythm. Knocks. 4. Pause. 3. I pressed my ear to the wall. Silence. And then again, 4. Pause. Someone, somewhere, was using the walls to speak. I returned to our chamber to find it undisturbed, Holmes's bed still empty. I sat at his desk and opened the drawer where he kept his cipher tools. Inside, I found something new, a parchment wrapped in cloth. I unfolded it to reveal a map, hand-drawn, of Longar Abbey. Not the one we were given upon arrival, but a schematic. Tunnels beneath, passages unnamed, and at the center, a chamber marked only with the Latin, vocem mutae, the voice of the mute. Holmes had discovered something, perhaps even found her. It was not until the 4th hour after midnight that I was awakened by movement. The window had opened. Standing there, framed by the pale moonlight, was a figure. She wore no habit, only a cloak of gray, her hair bound tightly beneath a veil. Her face I could not see, but her hands trembled. She held up a scrap of parchment and placed it gently on my bedside. Then she turned and climbed out the window, vanishing into the mist like a ghost returned to her grave. I reached for the note. There were no words, only a drawing. A nun kneeling before a shattered bell. And beneath it, the symbol again, Ouroboroi, broken this time, the circle incomplete. And at the very bottom, a single desperate phrase. He is not who he claims to be. Chapter 4. Cloak and Silence. The morning broke gray and thin, as though the sun itself feared to touch the cold stone of Longar Abbey. I awoke with the veiled woman's parchment still clenched in my hand. Its message, simple yet searing, he is not who he claims to be, gnawed at the base of my spine. The implications were immediate and damning. But who? The veiled woman herself? One of the monks? Holmes? No. I dismissed the last thought as quickly as it came. If ever I had been certain of anything in this life, it was Sherlock Holmes. His mind, his methods, his madness. But not deceit. Still, the warning chilled me. Holmes was somewhere within these walls, assuming the identity of a novice. And now someone, perhaps the same person who'd left that note, was implying that a masquerade was already underway by someone else. someone dangerous. I made my way down the cloisters just after prime, intent on finding any trace of the woman in gray. But the abbey had a way of swallowing paths. Every corridor turned subtly upon itself. Every doorway gave way to silence. I passed Sister Margaret, whose lips pressed into a line so thin it could have been an incision. She said nothing, but her eyes watched me too long. A sudden movement. Brother Alan, the groundskeeper, hauling burlap sacks into the eastern crypt. He noticed me watching and froze, but only for a second. Then he gave a curt nod and disappeared beneath the stairwell. Curiosity gripped me. I followed, silently, cautiously. The crypt was dark, lit only by a half-dozen candles wedged between stone shelves. Brother Alan knelt before one of the tombs. The sack was open at his side, filled not with refuse, but books. Ancient, worn, some torn in half at the spine. He was burning them. I saw it in his eyes. Fear. Not of me, but of whatever knowledge the books contained. "What are you doing?" I stepped into the light. He jumped, dropping a scorched page into the flames. "They're dangerous," he whispered. "She read them. That's how it started." "Agatha?" He nodded fervently. "She read them, then began writing things. Things no one could explain. Things she shouldn't know. People's names. Secrets. Secrets." He looked around, then stepped closer. "She knew who wasn't real." My breath caught. "Who?" But he shook his head. "If I tell you I vanished too. Like Agatha?" He pressed a hand to his lips. "No, not vanish like death. Vanish like forgotten, as though I were never here." I opened my mouth to question him further, but his eyes went wide. Behind me, a footstep. When I turned, the crypt was empty, but Alan was gone. And the books, gone too. Only ash remained. That evening, I retreated to the library with Holmes's map in hand. The passage marked Vocem Mute. The voice of the mute called to me. It lay beneath the western wing, through an access tunnel long since sealed. Using Holmes's charcoal markings as guide, I found a narrow crawl space behind the library's Latin section. I lit a lantern and squeezed through. Dust coated the air in sheets. The stone floor turned to gravel. The crawl gave way to a small, rounded chamber. At its center, a pedestal. No crucifix, no relic, just a flat stone slate with grooves worn smooth by centuries of touch. Around it, etched into the floor, were 7 small indentations. Circular, equidistant, as though something had once been placed there. The 7 bells? On the wall above the slate, a message had been scratched into the stone with some sharp object. "She still hears." I touched the slate. It was warm. I returned to our chamber to find it empty again. Holmes had not yet returned. On the desk, however, lay a new note in his hand. "Watson, I am close. The sanctum is not merely a place of prayer. It is a theater, a careful illusion. One of the brothers, Brother Cillian, does not sleep. I have observed him moving beneath the altar at ungodly hours. I intend to follow him tonight. Should I not return by matins, assume I have been compromised. Destroy any manuscripts you cannot secure." I read the letter 3 times. Compromised. The word haunted me. I made my way to the chapel at midnight, hiding among the pews. I waited in silence, and the shadows grew long. Then I saw him. A figure robed in black, face obscured, emerged from the back corridor. Not Holmes. Too tall. He moved with practiced care, making his way to the altar and kneeling, then pressing his palm to the marble base. A sound like stone against stone. The altar opened. He descended. I followed, heart pounding, down into the hollow beneath the chapel. A stairway wound down to a chamber lit by a single torch. There I saw it. Holmes, bound in chains, hands shackled above his head, his face bloodied. Before him stood the man in black, removing his hood. Brother Cillian, but not Cillian. Not the one we'd spoken with days before. This man's face was similar, but wrong. Too smooth, eyes wrong color. It was a replacement, an imposter. Holmes saw me. Barely. His lips moved. Run. But I did not run. I did the only thing I could do. I stepped from the shadows. "You're not Brother Cillian," I said. The imposter turned to me slowly. His smile was razor thin. "No," he said, but he was. Chapter 5. The Echo in the Chapel. For the briefest of moments, time itself held its breath. The man who was not Brother Cillian, whose resemblance was a mockery of familiarity, regarded me with that thin, almost curious smile. Behind him, Holmes hung by the wrists, blood streaking his temple, his expression defiant but fading. I had no weapon, no plan, only instinct. "Release him," I said. "You've no idea who you're dealing with." The imposter chuckled softly, a sound that had no place in a house of God. "Dr. Watson, Loyal even when outmatched. I was wondering when you'd arrive. You know me? He stepped forward into the full torchlight. His face, Brother Cillian's face, was too precise, like a painting copied without soul. Up close, I could now see it clearly. The subtle asymmetry, the unnatural smoothness around the mouth, the eyes too still. A mask, not cloth or porcelain, something far more sinister. A likeness molded and worn with terrifying precision. I know you both, he said, and you've walked directly into the end of a story that began long before you were born. Holmes stirred behind him. He's not Cillian. He's something else. Something older. The imposter turned, amused. I am merely what is needed. He stepped aside and gestured toward a second figure, one I hadn't seen before, emerging from the darkness. A woman in a heavy cloak, her eyes obscured by a veil. Her presence chilled the chamber more than the damp stone ever could. The imposter spoke again. This is Sister Alara. She is Agatha's twin. My breath caught. Agatha had no family. She had been taken in as an orphan. That's what we'd been told. Holmes's voice was hoarse. Twins often used in deception, Watson. One hidden, one seen. Agatha was the seen, I murmured. Then Alara was the silent one, the imposter answered. Kept out of sight, buried beneath vows, her mouth shut to keep a truth the world would not stomach. Alara stepped forward. From within her robes, she drew a small object, a golden bell. Its tongue had been removed. She was the voice, he said, almost reverently, even in silence, especially in silence. Alara raised the bell, and for a moment I felt the air around me still. A hum, vibrational, not audible, rippled through the stone. Holmes winced. It's the signal. The code, Watson? The bells are not just symbols, they're keys. The imposter turned to Holmes. You should not have come. Yet here I am, Holmes replied, smiling faintly, always nosing into old secrets, especially the ones sealed behind devotion and ritual. I stepped forward again. What do you want? Why the charade? Why the masquerade of monks and nuns? The imposter's face twisted. To protect what was never meant for the world's ears. This abbey holds more than books and prayers. It is a vault, a sanctum of memory. Within these walls, languages no longer spoken are preserved. Histories buried under centuries of silence. Secrets encoded into gestures, into liturgy, into songless chants. And Agatha discovered one, Holmes said weakly. Something you couldn't allow to surface. She read too deeply, Alara whispered, her voice like rustling parchment. Mute, no longer. Her voice was low and broken as though unused for years. She wrote in blood, I said. She wrote the truth, Alara replied, and they tried to bury her. In that moment, all shifted. Alara moved quickly to Holmes, unlocking his shackles with a key she wore around her neck. The imposter lunged. I intercepted him. It was not a noble battle. There was no gallant dueling. We crashed into the stone wall, grappling like beasts. His strength was unnatural. He moved like someone unfamiliar with his own limbs, jerking, unpredictable. I managed to bring my elbow into his throat, buying Holmes the second he needed. Holmes, free now, took the golden bell from Alara and struck the imposter across the temple. The mask cracked with a sickening snap. It didn't fall away. It clung, tearing skin beneath it. The man shrieked, not in pain, but in fury. Holmes dragged me back. We have to go. But he won't follow us. Not now. Not without his face. Alara guided us through a narrow stair hidden behind a crumbling alcove. The path twisted and rose, emerging behind the abbey's apse, far from prying eyes. As we climbed, Alara spoke in hushed tones. They thought I was broken, that I'd never speak. So they hid me. But I listened. I watched. I read everything she left. Alara, Holmes said, what did Agatha find? We paused in a stone vestibule beneath the bell tower. Alara turned and held up the broken bell. She found that the bells, 7 of them, each resonate with a specific frequency, a code. The abbey was built to transmit messages to the deaf, the blind, the forgotten. Agatha decoded one of the ancient texts. It wasn't prayer. It was a warning. A warning? I asked. She nodded. One word, repeated throughout. Holmes and I waited. Alara whispered, Revenant. We left her there, beneath the bells. She would not come further. Her place, she said, was with the echoes. As Holmes and I limped back to our chamber, dawn broke, and from the tower, a bell rang. One note. Then silence. The bell's note echoed through the hills like the cry of a wounded soul, pure, singular, and haunting. Holmes paused at the threshold of the cloister, eyes fixed skyward. That was not a call to prayer, he muttered. No, I said, still catching my breath. It sounded more like a signal. Holmes nodded. She's told them. Who? He looked to me grimly. The others. We crossed into the cloister and made our way back to our temporary quarters, keeping to the shadows. As we passed the herb garden, we glimpsed Brother Geraint kneeling among the rosemary, his hands stained crimson. Not with blood, but crushed berries, he claimed. He didn't look up. He simply murmured a Latin prayer over and over. Inside the chamber, Holmes collapsed into the chair by the hearth. He looked worn, yet his mind, ever resilient, was already leaping ahead. Alira's use of the bell changes everything, he said. Agatha discovered a system of communication that predates the monastic silence, a sequence of notes, tones, and physical resonance. And the revenant? I asked. She said it was a warning. Holmes steepled his fingers. A revenant, Watson, is not simply a ghost. It is a returned soul, one who walks again. I've heard legends, I said, folklore, tales meant to scare children. But this is not a tale, Holmes replied. This is a coded reality. If these manuscripts Alira speaks of are correct, someone here believed a specific soul had returned, perhaps not in supernatural form, but in flesh, a man reborn, replaced. An identity stolen? Holmes nodded. Exactly. He stood, pacing. Alira and Agatha believe this revenant walks the Abbey still, that he has taken the place of someone who once lived and breathed among them, perhaps more than one. My thoughts returned to the imposter, his unnatural strength, his eerie fluidity, and most of all, the way his mask had torn the skin beneath. It wasn't just a disguise, I said. It was embedded. Holmes turned to me, his eyes sharp. Which means we are not dealing with a mere deceiver. We are facing a system, a method. He crossed to the desk and opened one of the monastic ledgers we had found on arrival. Dates of entry, names of the brothers, assigned vocations. Watson, he said, tapping the page. Do you recall what Brother Allen said? That some names here no longer match the men who carry them? Yes, I said. He said Agatha wrote the names before she vanished. Holmes nodded. Which means there must be a record. Somewhere she kept track. Names of the replaced. A concordance of the revenants. He closed the ledger and looked up. We need to find Agatha's writings. I hesitated. They said she was buried, that she died of self-inflicted wounds. Then we start there. The graveyard lay to the east of the Abbey, beyond a tangle of yew trees that had not been trimmed in decades. The fog was heavy. The sun, though risen, barely pierced the canopy above. We found the burial plot with relative ease. A stone cross, plain and unmarked, stood where Sister Margaret had pointed days earlier. Holmes knelt beside it and began to examine the soil. Recently disturbed, he said. Not more than a fortnight ago. But she vanished months ago, I said. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Indeed. He reached into his coat, removed a small trowel, and began to dig. Within minutes, we struck something solid. A wooden box. But it was not a coffin. Holmes pried it open. Inside were not bones, but papers. Dozens of them, wrapped in linen, sealed with wax. And atop them all, a small, broken crucifix carved from obsidian. Holmes handled the pages gently, revealing sketches, marginalia, and reams of Latin, Welsh, and a cipher I did not recognize. She hid them here, he murmured, under her own grave, as if to say, the truth lies beneath the lie. At the center of the bundle was a single page with Agatha's unmistakable handwriting. I have seen the face of the false shepherd. He does not cast a shadow. He does not sleep. He repeats a prayer that is not written. Beneath the text, a list of names. Brother Cillian, marked with a cross. Sister Tulare, Father Gwillem, undated. Brother Allen, circled twice. My blood chilled. Brother Allen? Holmes stood. I saw the fear in his eyes, Watson, but now I wonder if it was his own. He looked back toward the Abbey. We need to confront him, and quickly. We returned just before Sext, the Abbey bells silent again. The hallways were emptier than usual. Tension hung in the air like incense. We found Brother Allen in the apothecary cellar, grinding roots at the mortar. He looked up as we entered, and smiled. Ah, he said calmly, the dead do walk. Holmes was on him in a flash. You lied, he said. You said you feared becoming forgotten. But you're not a victim, are you? You were the first. Allen didn't resist. I was necessary. The shepherd must always have a sentinel. What is the purpose, I asked. Why the replacements? What do you gain? He tilted his head. Continuity. You humans measure in lifetimes. We measure in memory. Holmes's voice was low. You are not Brother Allen. I am the echo of Brother Allen, he said. His shape, his rhythm, but not his frailty. Holmes reached into his coat and produced the broken bell. "This is your undoing. You underestimated what silence could preserve." For the first time, Alan's expression shifted. "You don't know what you're doing." "I don't need to," Holmes said. "Agatha already did." He struck the mortar with the bell. First, a resonant chime filled the cellar, so deep it shook dust from the beams above. Alan screamed, not in pain, but in distortion, as though the sound itself was unraveling him. He collapsed. And when we moved to his side, he was still breathing, but his face was no longer a face. It was shifting, in flux, a mask unmoored from memory. Outside, the bells of Longar Abbey tolled 7 notes, one for each name, each soul, each silence. And from somewhere deep in the Abbey's catacombs, a second bell answered. Not rung, sung, by a voice that had not spoken in decades. Chapter 6. The Revenant Codex. By dusk, the Abbey had grown strangely quiet, not the reverent silence of monastic practice, but a breathless, anticipatory stillness, as though the very stones awaited some long-prophesied word. Holmes sat cross-legged upon our chamber floor, manuscripts splayed about him like the entrails of some scholarly sacrifice. His brow was furrowed, his eyes flicked from page to page, tracing symbols, glyphs, and fragments of notes penned in Agatha's sharp, angular hand. "She wasn't mad, Watson," he said at last, gesturing to a tattered vellum leaf with an etching of 7 interlocked bells. "She was a cartographer, not of places, but of patterns." "Patterns of what?" I asked, handing him the next page. "Of memory," he replied, "of identity. This," he tapped one of the illustrations, "this is no mere musical notation. It's a mnemonic device, a cipher bound to sound. The bells of this abbey don't just call monks to prayer, they encode thought, they imprint it." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. Imprint it onto whom? Holmes looked up. Onto those who listen, willingly or otherwise. That night, we made our way through a section of the abbey we had, until then, only glimpsed in passing, the scriptorium of the dormant flame, a sealed wing known only to a handful of the elder monks. Its entrance lay behind the chapel's altar, says so, concealed beneath a false floorboard and masked by incense-heavy shadows. We had obtained the key from a lyra, not without a warning. "Do not read aloud," she had whispered. The words inside were meant for the dead. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a corridor unlike any other in the monastery. Here, the architecture turned Byzantine. Arches adorned with Ouroboros patterns, frescoes of cloaked figures holding blank-faced masks. A lingering scent of wax, ink, and mildew clung to every surface. "This section predates the abbey itself," Holmes murmured. "I would wager this chamber was once a druidic sanctum, repurposed when the first Benedictines arrived." At the end of the corridor stood a bronze door. Its surface was etched with a single Latin phrase, Memoria est forma perpetua. Memory is the eternal form. Inside, we found the codex. It was not a single book, but rather a chained library, rows of illuminated folios bound to iron rods, each secured with a clasp and padlock engraved with musical notes. The room was circular, with acoustics so precise that even our breathing rebounded from wall to wall in eerie chorus. At its center stood a stone pedestal. Upon it, a bronze singing bowl and a scroll bound in human hair. Holmes didn't hesitate. He removed his violin from its case, brought, curiously, even on this journey, and drew a bow slowly across the strings. The resonance was low and rich. One of the locks clicked open. "A tonal cipher," he said. "Remarkably elegant." "Holmes," I said cautiously, "what exactly are we hoping to find here?" He held up the newly opened folio. "Proof," he said. "That identity in this place is not sacred, but manufactured. The abbey's silence is not humility, it's containment. And these revenants, these false men and women, are not supernatural." He opened the book. "They are engineered." The pages contained what we'd only suspected, a catalog of transformations. Not of the body, but of the mind. The monks and nuns of Longar were, some of them hosts, volunteers, or more often victims, who underwent identity transfer through a process Holmes called harmonic mnemonic induction. The abbey's bells, attuned to exact frequencies, served as vessels for memory, preserving personalities, real or constructed, within musical resonance. When rung in precise sequence and in the presence of an unresisting mind, these sequences could overwrite the listener's very self. In essence, a bell-born possession. Each imprint was known as a form, and each recipient a vessel. I stared at the final line in one entry. Form 7A, reinstated successfully in vessel Cillian. Shadow resistance negligible. Permanent integration predicted. Holmes closed the book and sat in silence. They aren't just faking identities, he said. They're installing them. A sudden creak at the door jolted us both. We turned, and there stood Father Gwilym, the abbey's prior, draped in midnight robes, eyes hollow, a lit lantern in hand. "You were not meant to find this place," he said, voice toneless. "We had help," Holmes replied. Father Gwilym stepped forward. His gaze did not meet ours. It hovered somewhere just behind, as if observing something beyond the present moment. "You think you've uncovered something new," he said. "But this has been the way of things since the foundation of the order. Silence was never absence. It was transmission." "Transmission of what?" I asked. "Continuity," he answered. "We are not individuals here. We are links in a chain that spans centuries." "You've stolen lives," Holmes said. "Twisted minds. That's not continuity. That's conquest." Father Gwilym sighed. "Tell me, Mr. Holmes, how many crimes would you forgive in the name of eternal truth?" Holmes's reply was cold. "None." Father Gwilym raised the lantern, and then from the high alcoves, chanting began. Not Gregorian, not human. A single dissonant tone, sung in a looped cycle, filled the chamber. The codex began to hum. The air shivered with resonance. Holmes staggered. "They're activating a transfer." I grabbed his shoulder and pulled him toward the exit. "We need to leave. Now." As we ran, the codex behind us sang with growing volume, pages rustling as though windblown. The bronze bowl on the pedestal began to vibrate, its tone building to a pitch I could feel in my bones. The monks were coming. And they were not alone. We burst from the scriptorium into the cloister and ran straight into Elira, her face pale but resolute. She held a satchel, a bundle of manuscripts, and a crude iron tuning fork. "Take it," she said, handing the fork to Holmes. "It's the counterfrequency." "To what?" he asked, already panting. "To everything." In the distance, bells began to ring, not one at a time, but in chords. 7 notes at once. It was deafening. The stones of the abbey seemed to ripple underfoot. Glass cracked in its leaded panes. "They're preparing a mass over rite," Holmes shouted. "They mean to turn every novice into a vessel." Elira pointed toward the bell tower. "You must stop it there, at the source." "But you'll be caught," I began. "I've lived in silence long enough," she said. She turned and walked into the rising chorus. Holmes and I climbed the spiral stairs to the belfry, each step vibrating underfoot. At the top, we found the device, a mechanism of clockwork gears and silver rods, rotating discs inscribed with ancient notation, a music box for gods and ghosts. At its heart, a crystalline bell, pulsing with internal light. Holmes didn't hesitate. He struck the tuning fork and held it to the mechanism. There was a moment of suspension. Then, silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of negation. Every sound was devoured by that note. The crystal bell cracked. The gears ground to a halt. And far below in the abbey's nave, the chanting stopped. The revenants were undone. Some collapsed, unconscious. Others screamed, clutching their heads as fragments of foreign memory bled away. The abbey moaned like a dying beast. Holmes turned to me, sweat-streaked and shaking. "It's over," he said. And though I could still feel the vibration in my bones, I nodded. "Yes," I said, "but not forgotten." Chapter 7. The Nameless Choir. I have often borne witness to the fraying edges of human sanity. On battlefields, in hospitals, and beside homes through countless infernal cases. But never before had I stood so close to the edge where identity itself crumbles like wet paper. The abbey was still. Eerily so. No bell rang. No monk stirred. Even the wind seemed suspended, as if nature herself dared not draw breath in that hollowed place. Holmes and I descended the bell tower in silence, save for the faint creak of warped stone beneath our boots. The crystalline bell lay shattered in the chamber above us, its frequencies spent, its power undone, at least for now. But as we neared the cloisters once more, it became clear that the victory was incomplete. A sound met us. Soft, repetitive, singing. But not in any language I recognized. Not even Latin. We followed it to the east transept, where the chapel walls had begun to crack from the vibrations of the failed mass overrite. There, seated in a circle on the cold flagstone, were 7 novices, boys no older than 16, their heads shaved clean, their eyes wide and glassy. They sang in unison. Or rather, they emitted tones. Each mouth moved independently, and yet they harmonized into an eerie, mathematical chant. No melody, no cadence, a sound like breath through hollow bone. Holmes knelt. "They're not speaking," he said, tilting his head. "They're resonating." I looked around. The floor beneath them had been marked in chalk, in haste. Not a sigil or symbol, but what appeared to be geometric spirals. Patterns I had seen in druidic carvings during a brief excursion in Cornwall years ago. "They were caught mid-transfer," Holmes murmured. "Incomplete vessels." "Can we stop it?" I asked. He reached toward the nearest novice, but the moment he touched the boy's shoulder, all 7 stopped. Dead silence. Their eyes turned to him simultaneously, and then one spoke. Only it was not a voice of youth. It was old, parched, guttural. "You broke the seal too soon." Holmes recoiled just slightly. The speaker continued. "The codex was not the cage, it was the gate, and you have opened it halfway." "What are you?" Holmes asked, his voice low. The boy's lips peeled into something like a smile. "We are the choir, nameless, numberless, preserved in tone, echoed in flesh." I stepped forward. "You mean to say your consciousness is distributed across these boys?" The speaker turned to me. "We do not mean. We are." Holmes stood and whispered, "Watson, we must find the original source, before this becomes permanent. And if it already is, then these children are lost," he said grimly. We left the chapel and descended into the abbey's lowest levels, the ancient ossuary beneath the original foundations. Alira had once mentioned it in passing. The old choir, they called it. Even before Gregorian tones, they sang for the dead. The air down there was thick and wet. The stone turned from carved granite to rough-hewn slate. Roots hung from the ceiling like veins. We lit our lantern and pressed forward. At the far end, we found a sealed archway, blocked by a wooden screen carved with figures in procession, each faceless, each with mouth agape. At its center, a small aperture, shaped like a tuning fork. Holmes produced the fork Alira had given us. He slid it into the slot. The screen shuddered and opened. Inside was a chamber unlike anything I'd seen. Natural, not hewn. A grotto of acoustic perfection. The walls shimmered faintly, dust clinging to the air in golden motes. At its center stood a monolithic bell, not of metal but of stone, veined with quartz. Holmes approached it carefully. Around its base were bones, not buried, not strewn, but seated, arranged like an audience. And every skull was cracked down the center of the forehead. "A sacrificial chamber," Holmes said, awed. "But for resonance, not blood." He ran his hand along the bell. A sudden whisper filled the air, not from any mouth. From within the bell itself. "Why do you wake us?" Holmes froze. "Because you never left," he said. The whisper continued. "We were never meant to leave. We were preserved, stored, sung into the marrow." The bell began to pulse, softly. Holmes turned to me. "They stored personalities here, entire souls etched into sound waves, embedded in the stone like a phonograph etches wax." "You think this is the original choir?" I asked. "No," he said. "I think this is the choir." The whisper grew louder. "We remember you, Holmes, the one who cannot be stored." Holmes paled. How could they know you?" "I've seen this before," he whispered. "Once, in Persia, an enclave of Zoroastrian priests who preserved knowledge through harmonic breath. I broke the pattern. They remembered." He stepped forward. "If you exist through memory," he said, "then you are vulnerable to forgetting." He drew a vial from his coat. It was filled with a dense, black powder, gunmetal shavings from a failed chemical experiment I recalled from weeks prior. He poured it into the bell's lip. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Rewriting," he said. He struck a match, dropped it into the bell. There was no explosion, only a rush of air as if a breath long held had finally been released. The whisper fell silent. The dust in the air settled, and the resonance stopped. We emerged into the upper abbey just after dawn. The novices no longer sang. They were asleep. And when they awoke, they remembered nothing, not even their own names. Alira met us at the cloister gate. Her eyes were tired but free. "The voices are gone," she said. Holmes nodded. "The source has been unwritten." "And the choir?" He looked eastward, toward the rising sun. "They will never be silent," he said. "But now, at least, they are alone." We emerged from the stone chamber, half expecting to find the abbey abandoned, the spell broken, the echoes silenced. But evil, I have learned, seldom retreats with finality. It lingers, in dark corners, in unanswered questions, in the silence that follows a scream. The novices still slept in the transept, their bodies slack with exhaustion, their breathing shallow but steady. The chalk spirals had been smeared in the night, disrupted either by the violent resonance of the collapse or by some unseen hand. Holmes examined them closely. "Their minds have not entirely returned," he said, pressing 2 fingers to one boy's temple. "Some imprint remains." "Alira said they were innocent," I reminded him. "They still are," he replied, "but that innocence is now something fragile, tenuous, like frost underfoot." Suddenly, we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, quick, urgent, and approaching. Brother Cedric appeared, his face pale, one eye swollen from some recent blow. He clutched a scroll to his chest. "They know," he gasped. "Who knows?" Holmes asked. Cedric looked over his shoulder. "The others, the old ones, the monks who never age, the ones who sing but do not breathe, they're coming." We fled with Cedric through the western passage, away from the chapel toward the dormitory hall, which we now knew to be less a place of sleep than of containment. As we passed one of the side niches, I caught a glimpse of a nun, an older woman, face drawn, eyes sightless, humming to herself. The sound was low, pulsing. My ears rang in answer. I had to steady myself. "She's broadcasting," Holmes said. "A beacon." He drew a brass whistle from his coat, a rare acoustic disruptor he'd shown me once in Baker Street, and blew it once. No sound issued, but the nun reeled, clutching her ears, and collapsed. "She'll live," Holmes muttered, "but her song won't." We reached a small, private cloister known as the Veil Garden, a courtyard once reserved for novitiates approaching full vows. A single statue of the Madonna overlooked a dry fountain choked with ivy. Cedric handed Holmes the scroll. "I stole this from the abbot's quarters last night," he said. "He was burning documents. This one was marked with your name." Holmes unrolled it. The parchment was old, the ink brown with age. At the top, a sigil of intertwined serpents, beneath which read a phrase in Old Welsh, "Gani saini byddwch cofio." "By sound you shall be remembered." Below it, a roster, not of monks or nuns, but of forms. Each entry listed a form designation, the attributes it carried, some disturbingly specific: linguistic retention, pain suppression, doctrinal rigidity, and its current vessel. Some had names, some did not. And near the bottom, Form 2R applied to Alira. Status, stable. Resistance, minimal. Memories, overwritten. Holmes's hand gripped the scroll tightly. "She's one of them," I said, stunned. "Not one of them," Holmes whispered. "She's a host, but the original Alira, she may still be inside, waiting." I looked around. "And if they know we know?" He didn't reply. He folded the scroll carefully and slipped it inside his coat. Night was falling again. The bell tower was silent. The codex chamber remained sealed. But the abbey was no longer at peace. That evening, the monks sang vespers in a minor key. Off rhythm. Wrong. The harmonies grated the nerves. I felt a deep ache in my molars. Holmes and I kept to our quarters, where he studied the form roster with ruthless precision. He had begun drawing diagrams, mapping traits, estimating transfer dates, and matching them to living members of the abbey. "You see," he said, tapping a name with his pencil, "not all the monks were overwritten. Some were built." Built? Grown. Educated within the choir's doctrine from birth. Perfect vessels. He tapped another. But others, like Alira, were taken. Overwritten. Their personalities aren't gone, just buried. And if we can disrupt the acoustic lattice long enough, we may restore them. "You mean," I said slowly, "you mean to use the same method that enslaved them, to free them?" "Exactly." That night, I dreamt of bells, of hollow-eyed monks ringing tones that cracked the sky, of a stone choir singing beneath the world, bound in silence, praying in reverse. I woke with a cry, soaked in sweat. Holmes was already awake, standing at the window, staring at the rising moon. "They'll move soon," he said without turning. "Why?" "Because they know we found the source. They know we've read the forms, and they will do what all machines do when tampered with." He turned toward me. "They will reset." Chapter 8. The Mask Beneath the Veil. The abbey at dawn wore a different countenance, less a place of worship, more a fortress of shadows. Even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. Holmes and I had little time to rest. The weight of the forms and the possibility of mass resets pressed heavily upon us. Our every step was measured, every face a potential mask concealing a different soul. Our first destination was the refectorium, a vast hall where the monks took their meals in silence, their faces buried in bowls of coarse bread and thin soup. Despite the simplicity, I noticed an oddity. Each monk's posture, the angle of their hands, the tilt of their heads, seemed choreographed, as if they were enacting a ritual beyond the simple act of eating. Holmes whispered, "Observe, Watson. This is language without words. They communicate, but not with speech." A slight nod from one monk passed unnoticed by others, but Holmes caught it immediately. "It's a code," he said. "Gestural language, born out of necessity, or perhaps obedience." I felt a chill. We were joined by Elira, who now appeared less a silent sister and more an unwilling participant in a macabre dance. She moved with a careful precision, as if each step was a preordained line in a script she could no longer change. Holmes questioned her softly. "Your memory is fragmented, Elira. What do you recall of the veil?" Her eyes, once clouded with silence, flickered with reluctant understanding. "The veil is not just a place," she whispered. "It is a mask. We wear it to hide what lurks beneath." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And beneath that mask?" Elira paused. "Truth, or perhaps the greatest lie." That evening, Holmes and I explored the dormitory, the labyrinthine quarters where many monks slept, or were kept in somnolence. Behind a tapestry embroidered with a tree whose branches writhed like serpents, we discovered a hidden alcove. Inside, a small mirror hung on the wall. The glass was old, and the reflection it cast was faintly distorted. Holmes inspected it with care. "This mirror," he said, "was used in ceremonies of anamnesis, the recalling of lost memories through visual stimulus." He tapped the glass. "Watch closely, Watson." Holmes sat before the mirror, eyes closed. After a moment, his expression hardened. He opened his eyes and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "The mask beneath the veil is the self, not erased but suppressed." He turned to me. "They imprint not just memories, but false selves built from fragments of the originals. Each monk is a composite, a mosaic of many souls." I shivered. "How many of these men," I asked, "are truly themselves?" Holmes smiled grimly. "That, my dear Watson, is the ultimate question." Our investigation took a darker turn when we found a hidden manuscript beneath the refectory floorboards. Bound in cracked leather, it was written in a mixture of Latin and Welsh and signed with the monogram A.S. Holmes's eyes gleamed as he read aloud. "In silence lies power. The voice is a weapon, but also a prison. To speak is to betray the self. To listen is to surrender it." "This," Holmes explained, "is the creed of the Silent Sisterhood, a secret order within the Abbey dedicated to maintaining the harmonic lattice." Elira's voice trembled beside us. "They taught me this. I was to be the next veil." Holmes looked up sharply. "The next veil?" "The mask-bearer," she said. "The keeper of the silence and the lies." As night fell, the Abbey was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage tightening around our throats. The monks no longer merely watched us. They studied us, their silent gestures growing more urgent, more desperate. Holmes and I prepared for what lay ahead, knowing that beneath the mask of devotion, something ancient and merciless stirred. And the sign of the Silent Sister was not merely a cryptic message in blood, but a summons to face the truth behind the silence. Our discussion was interrupted by a sudden, sharp knocking from the Abbey's great oak doors. A chilling draft swept through the room, carrying with it an unplaceable scent, damp earth, incense, and something acrid like burnt parchment. Holmes rose cautiously, signaling for silence. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. It was no visitor, I realized. It was the Abbey itself, or rather its unseen custodians, demanding attention. Holmes approached the door, peered through the small grated window, and then turned back. "Brother Ignatius," he said quietly, "but he should be in his cell." Before we could question, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a shadowed figure wrapped in a monk's cowl, his face hidden beneath the heavy hood. "Brother Ignatius?" I said softly. The figure stepped inside, his footsteps muffled on the stone floor. "I have come to warn you," he said, voice rough and low. "The silence is breaking." Holmes arched a brow. "Explain yourself." Ignatius pulled back his hood, revealing a face marked with deep lines and eyes too bright for a man of his age. "The choir awakens," he said. "The veil's mask will fall, and with it, the fractures beneath." He paused, searching our faces. "You have trespassed too far, Mr. Holmes. The Abbey will respond." Holmes's expression hardened. "We came seeking truth, brother, and truth will not be denied." Ignatius gave a thin smile. "Then prepare yourself, for tonight the silence will be shattered." As he left, the atmosphere thickened. The Abbey seemed to pulse with a new energy, like the calm before a storm. Holmes and I exchanged a look. knowing the night would not pass quietly. We spent the remaining hours preparing. Holmes arranged our few protective devices, the acoustic disruptor, a small cache of phosphorus, and the cryptic scrolls we'd collected. I kept watch at the window, heart pounding as the moon rose high, casting eerie shadows through the twisted ivy outside. Suddenly, a low hum vibrated through the stones, a subtle, almost imperceptible vibration that grew steadily in strength. The choir was rising, and the veil of silence was about to be torn away. Chapter 9. The Echoes of Broken Voices. The air in Lungar Abbey was thick with anticipation, a palpable tension humming through its ancient stones as the choir's latent power stirred from its forced slumber. That night, I found myself unable to rest, my mind plagued with dreadful visions of the monks' silent songs twisting into something far more sinister. Holmes, ever composed, prepared silently in our quarters, assembling his instruments of investigation and defense. His gaze was sharp, his movements precise, every motion betraying his acute awareness of the danger we faced. "Watson," he said without looking up, "tonight we'll test the very limits of sound and silence, life and identity." I nodded solemnly, clutching my coat tighter around me as an eerie low vibration began to emanate through the walls. As midnight approached, the abbey fell into an unnatural hush. Even the usual creaks and groans of the old stonework were stilled, as though the building itself held its breath. Suddenly, from the depths below, a deep, resonant tone began, a slow, pulsing vibration that rippled through the floor beneath us. The sound was unlike any bell or chant I had ever heard. It was more primal, a bone-deep frequency that seemed to reach into the marrow. Holmes's eyes gleamed. The choir awakens. We hastened to the chapel, where the circle of novices had once sung their dissonant tones. But tonight, the space was empty, save for the scattered chalk spirals and a strange phosphorescent glow that illuminated the cracked stones. Then a whisper. At first barely audible, then swelling into a chorus of voices, fragmented, overlapping, and terrifying. They spoke not words, but shards of memory and pain. A child's laughter twisted into a scream, a mother's lullaby warped into a dirge, the scrape of a pen on parchment transformed into 1,000 fragmented syllables. The invisible choir was singing again, and this time it was not bound by flesh. Holmes raised his acoustic disruptor, aiming it at the center of the chapel. "Hold steady, Watson. We must fracture their lattice before the echoes consume us." The device emitted a piercing frequency, shattering the haunting chorus into jarring silence. But as the sound faded, the temperature plummeted, and shadows coalesced into figures, silent, faceless monks emerging from the stone walls themselves. One stepped forward, its form wavering like smoke. Holmes addressed it calmly. "Who are you?" The apparition's voice was hollow but clear. "We are the remnants, the original choir, cast out into resonance, trapped between silence and sound." "You were bound here?" Holmes pressed. "Yes, to contain the spread of the form. And now? We seek to reclaim our vessels, to restore the veil." A violent shudder shook the chapel, and I felt my own voice begin to falter, as if the choir's power threatened to erase my very existence. Holmes grasped my arm. "We must destroy the veil," he said urgently. "Cut the source, sever the tether." But as we turned toward the bell tower, a familiar figure barred our path. Elira. Her eyes, once vacant, now shone with fierce determination. "I will help you," she said. "But the cost will be great." Holmes nodded. "Together, then." The final battle for the Abbey's soul was at hand. Sound against silence, identity against oblivion. And in the heart of that ancient place, the sign of the Silent Sister awaited its reckoning. The Abbey's stones seemed to breathe that night, their ancient mortar humming with a latent energy neither of us had anticipated. The low vibration that filled the air was not merely sound, but something deeper, a resonance that stirred both body and mind, like a distant bell tolling from the depths of the earth. Holmes moved with deliberate purpose, his hand clutching the brass acoustic disruptor, a device I had long admired for its ingenious design. He had calibrated it for this very occasion, to fracture the invisible lattice that bound the choir's spectral essence to the Abbey's walls. "Watson," he said quietly, "the choir is no longer bound by flesh alone. Their voices have transcended the mortal realm and now echo as phantasms." I nodded, though the chill in my bones suggested that this transcendence was far from benign. We approached the chapel, its vaulted ceiling looming overhead, the shadows deepening like ink spilled across the stone floor. The chalk spirals that had marked the novices' silent songs were smeared and glowing faintly with a phosphorescent light, an eerie testament to the arcane power at work. Suddenly, the silence shattered. A whisper arose from the depths, a fractured symphony of disjointed voices layered atop one another. It was a sound that twisted the mind. Laughter and weeping intertwined. Lullabies that turned to screams, words half remembered, half forgotten. The invisible choir was singing. Holmes raised the disruptor, aiming it toward the center of the chapel. "Brace yourself," he warned. A piercing frequency cut through the spectral chorus, shattering the haunting voices into shards of silence. But that silence was not peace. It was the breath before a storm. From the fractured echoes emerged shapes, monks of smoke and shadow, their features blurred and faces devoid of identity. One stepped forward, tall and solemn, the remnants of a cassock fluttering like mist. Holmes regarded it calmly. "Who are you?" The apparition's voice was hollow, reverberating like a bell in a deep cavern. "We are the original choir, once flesh and blood, now bound to resonance. We are the prisoners and the wardens of the Abbey's dark secret." Holmes pressed further. "What bound you here? Why do you linger in this state?" "To contain the form," the spirit replied, "to prevent its spreading beyond these stones. But the lattice weakens, the veil cracks. We seek to reclaim our vessels and restore the true harmony." As the ghostly figure spoke, the chapel trembled. I felt a sudden pressure in my chest, as if the choir's power was reaching into my very soul. My voice faltered. Holmes grasped my arm firmly. "Hold fast, Watson. Their resonance tries to silence all who oppose them." He turned toward the bell tower, the source of the Abbey's deepest mystery. But before we could advance, Alira emerged from the shadows. Her eyes, once dull and empty, now burned with fierce resolve. "I will help you," she said softly but with conviction. "But understand, the price will be terrible." Holmes nodded. "We accept no lesser terms." Together, we ascended the spiral staircase to the bell tower, each step echoing like a heartbeat in the stillness. The walls here were etched with symbols, serpents coiled around crosses, ancient runes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. At the summit, we found the veil, a crystalline lattice suspended beneath the massive bell. Its threads shimmered with a spectral light, pulsing in time with the choir's haunting song. Holmes examined it carefully. "This lattice binds the choir's power. Sever it, and we break their hold." He prepared the disruptor once more, calibrating the frequency to shatter the lattice without collapsing the entire structure. Suddenly, the shadowy monks materialized around us, blocking our path. Their silent, faceless presence was overwhelming. Alira stepped forward. "I am the veil's bearer. I will confront them." She began to chant, not with words, but a sequence of tonal vibrations. The lattice responded, glowing brighter, as if recognizing its keeper. The spectral monks recoiled, momentarily disoriented. Holmes seized the moment. He activated the disruptor. A shrill, cascading wave tore through the lattice. Cracks spread like spiderwebs. The spectral choir's forms writhed and flickered. With a final thunderous crack, the lattice shattered. The abbey fell into profound silence. The spectral monks vanished, leaving only the faintest whisper on the air. Alira collapsed, drained but alive. Holmes and I helped her to her feet. "We have broken the veil," Holmes said gravely, "but the choir's legacy is not so easily undone." Alira looked at us with newfound clarity. "The abbey will remember, but now the silence can begin to heal." As dawn's first light crept through the stained glass, I felt a profound sense of relief, tempered by the knowledge that the scars of the silent sisterhood would linger. Holmes's gaze remained sharp, already turning to the next enigma. For in the shadows of Longar Abbey, not all secrets are laid to rest so easily. Chapter 10. The Veil Unraveled. The first light of dawn filtered through the narrow lancet windows of Longar Abbey, casting fractured beams upon the cracked stone floor. After the violent shattering of the veil, an eerie calm had settled, yet the air remained thick with unease. The abbey, as ancient as the hills themselves, seemed to hold its breath, as if wary of the revelations still to come. Holmes sat near the shattered lattice, examining its fragmented shards. The crystalline threads sparkled faintly, catching the early morning light like frozen tears. "The veil was more than a barrier," Holmes murmured. It was a prison and a key. It bound the choir's power, yes, but it also locked away something else. I watched him closely. What exactly? Holmes tapped a shard thoughtfully. A secret buried beneath centuries of silence. Alira, still weak but determined, joined us. I remember fragments, she said, her voice steady despite exhaustion. Before the vow of silence, before the form, there was a betrayal. Holmes's eyes narrowed. A betrayal? She nodded slowly. A nun, my predecessor, discovered something forbidden in the Abbey's archives. Something that could undo the entire sisterhood. She tried to speak, to warn the others, but was silenced. The veil was created to hide the truth and enforce the silence. With Alira's guidance, we descended to the Abbey's deepest crypts, where rows of ancient tomes and manuscripts lay untouched beneath layers of dust and neglect. Holmes's fingers traced the spines reverently. These are the lost histories of the Silent Sisterhood, he said, opening a brittle manuscript written in a mixture of Welsh and Latin. They hide the true origin of the choir and the purpose of the veil. He read aloud, "The Silent Sisterhood was formed to guard a sacred relic, an artifact of immense power, capable of altering memory and identity. This relic was hidden within the Abbey's walls, its influence masked by the veil. The choir's silence was both protection and prison." I shivered. The implications were staggering. As we explored the crypt, a faint whisper drifted through the air, an echo of voices long silenced. Holmes paused, listening intently. The choir may be freed, but the relic remains. Suddenly, a trapdoor in the floor creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. Without hesitation, Holmes led the way. The staircase descended into a subterranean chamber, its walls lined with ancient runes pulsing faintly with an ethereal light. At its center stood a pedestal, upon which rested a small obsidian box, intricately carved with symbols resembling the sign of the Silent Sister. Holmes approached cautiously. "This," he said, "is the source." He carefully opened the box. Inside lay a crystalline orb, swirling with shifting shadows, an object both mesmerizing and terrifying. "The relic," Holmes whispered, "it holds the power to manipulate memory itself, to erase, to rewrite, to silence." Suddenly, the chamber trembled. A voice echoed from the shadows. "You should not have come here." From the darkness emerged Brother Ignatius, his face contorted with fury. "The veil was meant to protect us all," he growled, "not to be torn asunder by outsiders." Holmes stepped forward calmly. "The truth must be known, Ignatius. Silence only breeds more secrets and suffering." Ignatius lunged, but Holmes was swift. A struggle ensued in the dim chamber, shadows flickering wildly against the ancient stone. In the chaos, the orb slipped from the pedestal and shattered on the floor, releasing a burst of shimmering light. For a moment, time seemed to fracture. Memories and voices flooded the chamber, revealing hidden pasts and forgotten faces. I saw visions of the Abbey's original sisters, the silent vows, the betrayal that had birthed the veil. And amidst the chaos, Alira stepped forward, breaking her vow for the first time in years. "The silence ends here," she declared, her voice strong and clear. As the echoes faded, the Abbey felt lighter, freed from the weight of centuries-old silence. Holmes looked at me, his eyes reflecting both relief and resolve. "The sign of the Silent Sister was not just a mystery to be solved," he said. "It was a call to awaken." And with that, the Abbey began its slow journey toward renewal, its secrets finally laid bare beneath the Welsh sun. The crystalline orb lay shattered on the cold stone floor, its fragments scattering like fractured stars in the dim chamber light. The burst of shimmering illumination that followed felt almost otherworldly, as if the very fabric of time and memory had been momentarily rent asunder. I staggered back, my senses overwhelmed by a flood of visions. Ghostly echoes of the Abbey's past surfacing in an incomprehensible torrent. Faces I could barely place flickered before me. A young novice clutching a worn prayer book, a stern abbess whose eyes seemed to bore into my soul, a frantic figure scribbling feverishly in blood-red ink, just like the Silent Sister who had vanished. Holmes, ever the pillar of composure, steadied himself against the cold pedestal. His eyes sparkled with a fierce intensity. "The relic was a vessel of memory, Watson, a repository of souls and secrets bound by the Silent Sisterhood's will." From the shadows, Brother Ignatius snarled, his fury undiminished despite the chaos. "You do not understand what you have unleashed. The veil was our safeguard. our shield against oblivion. Without it, the choir's power will consume us all." Holmes stepped forward, voice calm but resolute. The veil imprisoned more than the choir. It trapped the truth, the past, and the very voices of those who sought to protect it. "Ignatius, the silence has suffocated this abbey. It is time for light and sound to reclaim their rightful place." Ignatius's eyes flashed with desperation. "Then you will doom us all." He lunged once more, but Holmes intercepted him with a swift maneuver, disarming the enraged monk. Alira, pale but determined, moved to the shattered relic, her fingers hovering over the fragments. "The orb held memories, fragments of every sister who ever took the vow," she explained softly. "When it broke, those memories spilled forth. The abbey's silence will finally be broken." I looked around the chamber, feeling as if we stood at the crossroads of history and destiny. Holmes turned to me, eyes narrowed in thought. "Watson, our task is not finished. The abbey must confront the truth of its past and the consequences of this fractured silence." As we ascended the stairs back to the main hall, the abbey felt transformed. The oppressive stillness was replaced by a subtle hum, a resonance of voices once silenced, now whispering their stories. In the great hall, the monks and nuns gathered, faces a mixture of fear, hope, and curiosity. Alira spoke to them, her voice clear and commanding. The silence that bound us was born of fear and secrecy. It kept us safe, but also trapped us in shadows. It is time to listen, to remember, to speak, and to heal. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Holmes observed quietly. The sign of the Silent Sister is not merely a mystery to be solved, it is a legacy to be understood and embraced. That night, as I lay awake in our chamber, the abbey's whispered voices drifted through the stone walls, no longer silent, but alive with the echoes of history, memory, and a future reclaimed. Holmes's hand found mine briefly. "The abbey's secrets are laid bare, Watson, but silence has a way of returning. We must remain vigilant." I nodded, understanding that while the veil was broken, the shadows it concealed would linger. Chapter 11. Whispers Beyond the Abbey. The dawn broke with a fragile serenity over Longar Abbey. Though the veil had been shattered and the choir's power seemingly diminished, a restless energy pulsed beneath the surface, like an unsettled sea. The abbey's inhabitants moved differently now. No longer burdened by enforced silence, their faces bore expressions of cautious hope mingled with apprehension. The centuries of silence had been broken, but what lay beyond the walls remained shrouded in uncertainty. Holmes and I found ourselves drawn to the abbey's library, a vast chamber of towering shelves that held more than just books. Here were codices and manuscripts, some ancient beyond reckoning, others penned within the past few years in cryptic ciphers and coded script. "Holmes," I said, "the destruction of the veil may have freed the choir, but I fear it has also released secrets best left buried." He nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, Watson. The abbey's silence was a safeguard, flawed though it was. Now, we must delve into those secrets and understand what whispers have been unleashed." Our investigation led us to a hidden compartment behind a weathered tapestry depicting St. David, patron of Wales. Inside, we discovered a small bundle of parchment, tied with a faded ribbon. Holmes carefully untied it, revealing letters and fragments of a diary, written in a hurried hand. "They are the writings of Sister Elwyn," Holmes explained, "the nun who vanished before the Silent Sister's final message was found." The diary spoke of strange rituals, of an ancient relic hidden deep within the abbey's catacombs, and of a conspiracy to preserve the choir's power at any cost. One passage caught my eye. "The sign is more than a symbol. It is a binding force. Break it, and the voices will rise beyond these walls, seeking to reclaim what was lost. Silence is not the answer. It is the prison." The gravity of Sister Elwyn's words weighed heavily upon us. If the choir's influence extended beyond the abbey, then the threat was far from contained. Holmes's sharp gaze met mine. "We must explore the catacombs before others with darker intentions do." The catacombs were a labyrinth of damp, narrow passages, lined with ancient stone coffins and cryptic inscriptions. The air was thick with the scent of earth and forgotten prayers. With only flickering lanterns to guide us, Holmes and I descended deeper into the bowels of the abbey. Suddenly, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, echoed through the tunnels. It was a whisper, barely audible, yet laden with unmistakable urgency. "Did you hear that, Holmes?" He nodded, eyes gleaming. "The choir's remnants may still linger here in the dark." We pressed onward until we reached a hidden chamber, its walls adorned with more runes and the unmistakable sign of the Silent Sister carved into the stone. At its center lay a stone altar, upon which rested a sealed chest. Holmes approached cautiously, examining the lock. "This is no ordinary chest, Watson. It is bound by wards, magical and mechanical." With deft hands, he manipulated a series of hidden levers and tumblers. The lock clicked open with a sound that echoed like a sigh through the chamber. Inside, we found a collection of relics, a silver crucifix, fragments of parchment inscribed with strange symbols, and most curiously, a small wooden box sealed with wax. Holmes broke the seal carefully and lifted the lid. Inside was a delicate pendant, shaped like a tiny key, inscribed with the same cryptic sign we had seen throughout the abbey. "It appears to be the key to something far greater than any of us imagined," Holmes said quietly. Our discovery was interrupted by the sudden sound of footsteps, hasty, purposeful, approaching from the tunnel entrance. "Someone else is here," I whispered, reaching for my revolver. Holmes slipped the pendant into his pocket and gestured for silence. Emerging from the shadows was a figure cloaked in a dark habit, face obscured by a hood. "I would tread carefully, gentlemen," the stranger said in a low voice. "The choir's silence has many guardians, some less forgiving than the abbey's monks." Holmes stepped forward, eyes piercing beneath his deerstalker. "And you are?" The figure lowered the hood, revealing a woman with sharp features and eyes cold as winter frost. "Call me Morrigan, and I am here to ensure the silence remains unbroken." A chill passed through me as the true scope of the danger became clear. The battle for the Abbey's secrets had only just begun. The morning sun, pale and hesitant, cast long shadows across the ancient stones of Longar Abbey. Outside, the rolling Welsh hills stretched endlessly, shrouded in a mist that seemed reluctant to lift. Within the Abbey's walls, however, the atmosphere was charged with a different kind of tension, one wrought by shattered silence and the flood of secrets unleashed. Holmes and I had spent the early hours in the Abbey's vast library, a dim, dusty chamber redolent of leather-bound volumes and ancient parchment. The air was thick with the musk of forgotten knowledge, a testament to the Abbey's centuries of scholarship and secrecy. Holmes ran a finger lightly across the spines of the books, his gaze intent. The destruction of the veil did not merely free the choir. It has undone the barriers between past and present, between memory and reality. I nodded, recalling the spectral choir that had materialized in the chapel, their ghostly presence tethered to memories encoded within the shattered relic. "Have you found anything more about Sister Elwyn's writings?" I asked, mindful that every detail might hold the key to understanding the Abbey's enigma. Holmes carefully unfolded a bundle of brittle papers, its edges frayed with age. "Indeed, these letters and diary fragments paint a picture of a woman caught between devotion and desperation. She wrote of a relic hidden within the Abbey, a source of power both feared and revered. But more disturbingly, she hinted at a conspiracy among the Silent Sisterhood, a faction willing to maintain silence at any cost." I leaned closer, absorbing the gravity of the words. "They say the sign is a binding force. But what if it is a prison for truths too terrible to speak aloud?" Sister Elwyn's hand trembled on the page. Holmes's eyes darkened. "That is the question, Watson. How many have suffered in silence? How many voices have been snuffed out to preserve this sign?" Our deliberations were interrupted by the soft creak of footsteps. Alira appeared in the doorway, her expression pale but resolute. "I overheard your conversation," she said quietly. "If the sign is a prison, then we are all its captives." Holmes regarded her thoughtfully. "The Abbey must confront its past, Alira. There are answers below, deep within the catacombs." She nodded. "I will guide you." The descent into the catacombs was like stepping back through centuries of silence and shadow. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth and ancient stone. Our lanterns cast wavering light over carved sarcophagi and cryptic inscriptions, worn by time yet defiant in their mystery. Holmes paused before a large iron-bound door, its surface etched with arcane runes. The same signs we had seen throughout the Abbey, now tinged with a sinister significance. "This must be the entrance to the hidden chamber mentioned in Elwyn's diary," Holmes whispered. Alira produced a small, intricately carved key, its design echoing the sign of the Silent Sister. With a deliberate turn, the lock clicked open. Inside the chamber, the walls glowed faintly with phosphorescent moss, revealing a circle of carved symbols surrounding a stone altar. Atop the altar rested an ornate chest, its surface encrusted with strange sigils and bound by a complex locking mechanism, both magical and mechanical. Holmes knelt, studying the lock's design with his usual intensity. It will take all my skills to open this without triggering any wards. Minutes passed as he deftly manipulated hidden levers, tumblers clicking softly in the silence. At last, the chest creaked open. Inside lay a collection of relics, a silver crucifix, several tattered parchments inscribed with unfamiliar symbols, and a small wooden box sealed with crimson wax. Holmes gently lifted the box, breaking the wax seal. Within lay a delicate pendant shaped like a tiny key, its surface etched with the cryptic sign of the Silent Sister. "This," Holmes said, holding it up to the lantern light, "appears to be the literal key to the Silent Sisterhood's deepest secret." Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the sound of footsteps, hurried and deliberate, echoing down the stone corridors. "Someone approaches," I whispered, reaching instinctively for my revolver. Holmes slipped the pendant into his waistcoat pocket and gestured for us to remain silent. From the shadows emerged a figure draped in a dark habit, the hood obscuring all but the sharpest angles of her face. "I would advise caution, gentlemen," she said in a voice low and icy. "The Silent Sisterhood's guardians do not take kindly to intruders." Holmes stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "And you are?" The woman lowered her hood, revealing eyes cold as winter frost and a face etched with years of harsh resolve. "Call me Morrigan," she said. "I have sworn to protect the silence, whatever the cost." A shiver ran down my spine as the true scope of the danger became clear. Here was a guardian not merely of the Abbey, but of its darkest secrets, a living embodiment of the silence we sought to break. Holmes's voice was calm but firm. "The silence you protect has caused much suffering. It is time for the truth to be heard." Morrigan smiled thinly. "Truth is a double-edged sword, Mr. Holmes. Some secrets must remain buried." She reached into her habit and withdrew a small dagger, its blade gleaming wickedly in the lantern light. "Will you listen to the silence, or will you be silenced?" The tension in the chamber was suffocating. Alira stepped forward, placing herself between Holmes and Morrigan. "There is a choice," Alira said quietly. "We can continue the cycle of fear and silence, or we can break free, together." Morrigan's eyes flickered with uncertainty. Holmes seized the moment. "We seek not to destroy your order, but to restore it, to heal the wounds inflicted by years of fear." Slowly, Morrigan lowered her dagger. "Perhaps," she whispered, "there is another way." As the first light of morning began to seep through cracks in the stone, the Abbey's long-held secrets trembled on the edge of revelation. The battle for silence was not yet over, but the whisper of change was unmistakable. Chapter 12. The Guardians of Silence. The early morning mist still clung to the Abbey's ancient stones when Morrigan lowered her dagger and regarded us with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant respect. The flickering lantern light cast long shadows in the chamber, deepening the lines etched into her sharp features. Holmes's gaze remained steady. "Morrigan, the Abbey has suffered enough under the weight of silence. We are here not to destroy, but to understand, to restore what has been fractured." For a long moment, Morrigan said nothing. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she sheathed the blade and extended her hand. "Very well, Mr. Holmes," she said quietly. "But know this. I am bound by the oldest oath, to guard the secrets of the Silent Sisterhood, no matter the cost. If you wish to uncover the truth, you must first prove that you are worthy." Holmes inclined his head, a glint of challenge in his eyes. "Consider us ready." Morrigan led us through a narrow passage that spiraled deeper into the Abbey's bowels, a labyrinthine network known only to the innermost members of the Sisterhood. The walls here were slick with moisture, and the air grew colder with every step, heavy with the scent of earth and forgotten prayers. As we walked, she spoke softly, her voice a mixture of reverence and warning. The Silent Sisterhood was founded not merely as a religious order, but as custodians of a power far older than this abbey. The sign you have seen, the symbol carved into stone and woven into the veil, is a mark of that power, It binds us to a covenant with forces beyond mortal understanding. Holmes's brow furrowed. What forces do you mean? Spirits. Guardians, entities that have watched over this land since time immemorial. They granted us silence as a shield, a way to protect the relic and the knowledge it contains. But the price was high. Our voices, our histories, even our identities were swallowed in the vow. We emerged into a vast chamber, vaulted and dimly lit by clusters of phosphorescent fungi that clung to the rocky walls like spectral blooms. At its center stood an ancient stone altar, scarred by time and ritual. Morgan gestured toward it. This is the heart of the choir. It is here that the Silent Sisters made their covenant, a pact sealed in blood and silence. Holmes stepped closer, examining the faded markings etched into the altar's surface. Explain the pact, Holmes urged. Morgan's eyes darkened. The choir's power comes from the relic you found, the orb. It holds the memories of every sister who has ever taken the vow, binding them to this place and to one another. To protect it, we had to become silent, to forsake speech and even names. In return, the spirits granted us protection and the ability to influence the world through subtle means. She turned to Alira. You broke the vow, sister. That act sent ripples through the covenant. Alira bowed her head, voice barely a whisper. I sought only to save the Abbey. Morgan's gaze softened slightly. And yet your actions threaten the balance. The orb's destruction has weakened the pact. Now the spirits stir, restless and unpredictable. Holmes paced slowly around the chamber, absorbing every detail. So the veil was not merely a prison, but a barrier, a containment field for the spirit's power? Yes, Morgan replied. When it shattered, the spirit's influence seeped beyond the Abbey's walls. That is why the Abbey's silence is breaking. Then the threat is greater than we imagined, I said. Not just the choir, but the spirits themselves. Morgan nodded gravely. Indeed. And that is why the guardians remain vigilant. Suddenly, the chamber's air shifted, growing heavy and charged. A low hum resonated through the stone, growing louder until it became a haunting chorus, the spectral choir, drawn to the heart of the choir. The translucent figures appeared, ethereal and mournful, circling the altar with voices raised in a wordless lament. Holmes and I stood transfixed as the spirit's presence washed over us. Ancient memories, forgotten pain, and desperate yearning intertwined in their mournful song. Alira stepped forward, raising a trembling hand. We must calm them, she said softly. They are bound by the sign. We can restore their peace if we rekindle the covenant. Holmes nodded. What must we do? Together with Morgan and Alira, we began a ritual long lost to time, a delicate balance of spoken word, gesture, and silent intention. As Alira chanted the ancient hymns, Morgan traced the sign in the air, and Holmes carefully arranged fragments of the orb's shattered pieces upon the altar. The choir's song grew quieter, shifting from sorrow to hope. Finally, as the last note faded, the spirits dissolved into shimmering motes of light, retreating to their eternal rest. Exhausted but resolute, we gathered our thoughts. Holmes turned to Morgan. The covenant must be reforged, but it cannot be one of silence and fear. The Abbey needs guardians who speak, who remember, and who face the truth. Morgan met his gaze steadily. And who will lead such a change? Holmes smiled faintly. That, my friend, is the question for all of us. As we emerged from the depths of the Abbey into the pale dawn, I realized that the silence had been broken, not just by the shattered veil, but by a newfound willingness to confront the past and shape the future. The guardians of silence were no longer just protectors of secrets, but heralds of a new dawn. Chapter 13. The Legacy of the Silent Sister. The days following our descent into the catacombs were charged with a curious mixture of tension and cautious optimism. The Abbey, long a fortress of silence and shadows, seemed to breathe anew, as though the very stones soaked with centuries of secrets were eager to exhale. Yet beneath this tentative renewal lurked an uneasy question. What would be the true cost of unveiling the legacy of the Silent Sister? Holmes and I found ourselves increasingly drawn to the Abbey's historical records, the parchments and tomes preserved in the library's deepest recesses. These were no ordinary chronicles. They bore the marks of meticulous care, but also of deliberate obfuscation. Pages had been removed or overwritten. Marginal notes had been redacted, and the language of many manuscripts shifted from Latin to cryptic symbols whose meaning eluded even a lira. The very nature of the Silent Sisterhood, their vow of silence, their masked identity, and their cryptic symbolism seemed to ripple through every facet of the Abbey's history, a legacy both revered and feared. One particular afternoon, as a storm raged beyond the Abbey walls, and the wind howled like a banshee through the ancient oaks, Holmes and I pored over an illuminated manuscript that appeared to be the Abbey's foundational charter. The vellum was cracked and yellowed, yet the vibrant inks still bore images of robed figures and elaborate seals. "This," Holmes murmured, tracing the faded calligraphy with his slender finger, "may provide the key to understanding the origins of the Silent Sisterhood, and perhaps the true nature of the sign itself." The text told of a distant era, when a fierce conflict between local clans threatened the fragile peace of the Welsh countryside. According to the legend, a young woman of noble birth, known only as Seren, had taken a vow to bring about reconciliation. Her silence was not born solely of devotion, but as an act of penance for a grievous betrayal that had plunged the land into bloodshed. The story was woven with symbolism. Seren's silence became a sacred pact with the voices beyond, mysterious entities said to dwell in the liminal spaces between worlds. These spirits, neither wholly benevolent nor malevolent, granted her and her followers powers beyond mortal comprehension, powers that were bound to the sign, a glyph representing both protection and imprisonment. Holmes's eyes gleamed with fascination. The Silent Sisterhood was founded not merely as a religious order, but as a secret society, guardians of a power both spiritual and arcane. I nodded slowly. And the sign, then, is the key to that power? More than a key, Watson. It is a bond, a curse, and a promise. Breaking it risks unraveling everything, but preserving it in silence may doom those who bear it. As I contemplated these weighty truths, a sudden knock at the library door interrupted our musings. Elira entered, her expression grave. "There is news from the village," she said. "Strange occurrences. People report hearing voices carried on the wind, whispers that unsettle even the most steadfast." Holmes frowned. "The spirits are restless." That evening, under a sky swollen with storm clouds, Holmes and I ventured beyond the Abbey walls. The village of Longar was a scattering of stone cottages nestled amid rolling hills, a place where tradition held sway and superstition mingled freely with faith. The villagers eyed us warily, their faces etched with worry. One elderly man, Reese, spoke of hearing eerie chants echoing through the night. Not from the Abbey, but from the ancient burial mounds nearby. "The spirits have been disturbed," he said, his voice trembling. "The Silent Sisters' silence is broken, and with it, the veil between worlds grows thin." Holmes listened intently, then turned to me. "Watson, it seems the legacy of the Silent Sister is no longer confined to these walls. The powers bound to the sign reach far beyond what we imagined." Back at the Abbey, we convened with Morrigan and Elira to discuss the unfolding crisis. "The spirit's unrest threatens not only the Abbey, but the entire region," Morrigan warned. "We must seek the source and find a way to restore the covenant." Elira, her usually serene demeanor now shadowed with doubt, added, "The relic we found, the pieces of the orb, are the key. We must find a way to reassemble it." Holmes's mind raced with possibilities. But with the veil destroyed, its power diminished. How can we hope to restore what has been broken? "The ancient manuscripts speak of a ritual," Morrigan said, "one that requires not only the relic, but the blood of the Silent Sisters' lineage." The words struck me like a thunderclap. "Bloodline, but the sisters are anonymous. Their identities lost in silence." Morrigan's eyes gleamed with sorrow. "Not all secrets are forgotten. Some are hidden in plain sight, veiled beneath layers of deception." Holmes and I resolved to delve deeper into the Abbey's archives and the village's oral histories. We spent days piecing together fragments of genealogies and cryptic references until a startling hypothesis took shape. The Silent Sisterhood's true legacy might be entwined with a hidden family, one that had infiltrated both the Abbey and the surrounding countryside under the cloak of silence. One evening, as candlelight flickered against the stone walls, Holmes shared his deductions. "Watson, the Silent Sister was not simply a figure of religious devotion, but a linchpin in a grander design. The vow of silence concealed identities and alliances, an intricate web of politics, power, and protection. He paused, eyes fixed on the map of the region. If we can uncover the living descendants of Saren's line, we may find the final piece to restore the covenant and quell the spirits. Our search was arduous and fraught with danger. As word spread of our inquiry, some villagers grew hostile, fearing that unearthing the past would invite calamity. At one point, a shadowy figure followed us through the woods near the abbey, their presence a constant reminder that unseen forces sought to keep the silent sisterhood's secrets buried. One night, a cryptic note was slipped beneath my door. Some stones are better left unturned. The sign watches. Holmes examined it with a glint of determination. A warning, Watson, but we press onward. Through patient questioning and subtle deduction, we finally identified a family, the Vaughans, who had long been intertwined with the Abbey's history, yet lived openly in the village. Holmes arranged to meet with the family patriarch, an austere man named Idris Vaughan, whose piercing eyes betrayed a legacy of burden. In the dim light of the Vaughan estate, Idris revealed fragments of his family's hidden past, stories of a sister who vanished decades ago, whispered to have been part of the silent sisterhood, and a pendant passed down through generations bearing the sign. Your arrival disturbs forces I have long sought to keep at bay, Idris warned, but perhaps the time has come to face what we have hidden. Armed with this knowledge, Holmes and I returned to the Abbey, pendant in hand, ready to confront the legacy of the silent sister and the restless spirits that demanded peace. The night was thick with portent as we prepared for the ritual that might restore the covenant, or shatter all that remained of the Abbey's fragile peace. As the choir's ethereal voices once again stirred in the shadows, I realized that the true mystery was not the silence itself, but the voices yearning to be heard beyond it. Chapter 14. The Ritual of the Silent Sister. The air within the Abbey was thick with anticipation as twilight bled through the narrow lancet windows, casting long, trembling shadows across the stone floors. Holmes, Alira, Morgan, Idris Vaughan, and I gathered once more in the heart of the choir, that ancient chamber of whispering ghosts and lingering oaths. The fragments of the shattered orb, the last tangible remnant of the silent sisterhood's covenant, lay meticulously arranged on the altar, flanked by the pendant bearing the sign, which Idris had entrusted to us with a grave solemnity. Holmes's fingers traced the air above the relics as he murmured, "This ceremony will not merely be a restoration, it will be a reckoning." Alira began the ritual, her voice a haunting melody that echoed the ancient hymns inscribed in the Abbey's oldest manuscripts. Her words were no longer mere incantations, but a call to the spirits themselves, beseeching, coaxing, and commanding in a language older than the Abbey stones. Morgan, standing sentinel by the entrance, held her dagger high, the blade gleaming like a shard of moonlight. Idris knelt beside the altar, clutching the pendant as though it were a lifeline, tethering him to the past. Holmes observed every gesture, every flicker of light, every shifting shadow, his mind racing to decipher the balance between the physical and the spiritual that governed this ancient rite. The chamber began to pulse with energy, an almost tangible force that hummed in the air and caused the very stones beneath us to vibrate. The phosphorescent fungi on the walls flickered, casting the room into an otherworldly glow. Then, from the depths of the chamber, a chorus of whispers rose, voices at once sorrowful and fierce. The choir of spirits bound to the silent sisterhood. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the chamber, snuffing out the candles and plunging us into near darkness. Only the eerie glow from the fungi and the faint shimmer of the orb fragments illuminated the scene. Holmes's voice rang out calmly. "Steady, everyone. The pact is breaking free." Alira's chanting intensified, her hands weaving intricate signs in the air, signs I recognized now as the very glyphs of the sign itself. Idris's grip tightened on the pendant as if to anchor himself against unseen forces. A spectral figure emerged from the shadows, ethereal, translucent, yet bearing unmistakable human features. It was Saren, the silent sister herself, bound by her vow yet freed momentarily by the ritual. Her eyes, deep pools of sorrow and resolve, locked onto Idris. "You bear the bloodline," she whispered, voice like the rustling of autumn leaves. "The legacy you carry is both a blessing and a burden." Holmes stepped forward, voice steady yet filled with urgency. "Saren, we seek to restore the covenant and end the unrest that threatens both this abbey and the world beyond." The apparition's gaze flickered toward the pendant. "The sign must be whole. Only then can the silence be lifted without destroying the bond." With a solemn nod, Idris extended the pendant over the shattered orb fragments. A brilliant light burst forth, enveloping the altar and casting a radiant halo throughout the chamber. The fragments began to draw together, floating and reassembling in midair, the orb reforming slowly but inexorably. The spirit's chorus swelled into a triumphant hymn, lifting the chamber's heavy atmosphere and infusing it with a radiant warmth. The bond was being restored, but not without cost. Saren's figure began to fade, her voice now a gentle caress upon the wind. "Remember, silence is not absence, but respect. The legacy of the Silent Sister is to listen beyond words and to speak with purpose when the time is right." With that, she vanished, leaving behind an air of peace and a promise renewed. As dawn broke over the Welsh hills, the abbey's ancient stones seemed to breathe easier, the weight of centuries lifted just enough to allow for light and hope. Holmes turned to me, a rare softness in his eyes. "Watson, the legacy of the Silent Sister is a testament to the power of restraint and revelation alike. Silence protected the past, but now, truth must be spoken." Alira smiled faintly, the vow of silence no longer an imprisonment, but a sacred choice. Idris, clutching the pendant, spoke with quiet conviction. "We are the guardians, not of silence alone, but of balance. The abbey will live, not in shadow, but in light." As we prepared to depart the abbey, the village of Longar seemed transformed, its people lighter, less burdened by unseen fears. The whispers on the wind were now songs of remembrance, not warning. Holmes and I exchanged a glance that spoke of mysteries solved, but also of new journeys awaiting us in the shadows of history and the depths of human nature. For in every silence lies a story waiting to be heard, and in every sign, a truth waiting to be revealed. The abbey's walls seemed to close in around us as twilight settled, deepening the shadows and muting the colors of the stained glass windows into smoky grays. I felt the weight of centuries pressing upon my shoulders, the accumulated prayers, secrets, and solemn vows etched invisibly into the very stones beneath our feet. Holmes, standing near the altar, was a picture of intense concentration, his fingers lightly tracing the intricate carvings on the orb fragments arrayed before him. The pendant, the ancient talisman bearing the sign, rested carefully in Idris Vaughn's outstretched hands, his features set in a grim mask of resolve. Alira and Morrigan stood on either side, their expressions both resolute and tinged with anxiety. The chamber was filled with a palpable stillness, as if the air itself was holding its breath in anticipation. I, too, felt a tightening in my chest, a mingling of dread and hope. This was no ordinary ceremony. It was an ancient invocation fraught with peril, demanding courage beyond mere words. Alira began the ritual, her voice low and steady, weaving the archaic hymns of the Silent Sisterhood. The words were unlike any language I had heard, half Latin, half something more primal, more elemental. As she sang, her hands moved with an elegant grace, sketching the sacred symbols of the sign in the air. The flickering candlelight caught the delicate embroidery of her habit, casting shifting patterns on the cold stone. Morrigan stood watchful at the threshold, her dagger gleaming like a shard of silver, ready to defend the sanctity of the ritual from any unwelcome disturbance. Idris clutched the pendant as though it were his last link to a world slipping into oblivion. Holmes observed everything with piercing intensity, his mind racing beneath his composed exterior. Every gesture, every word, seemed to carry a significance far beyond the immediate moment, connecting us to the abbey's hidden past and the restless spirits that dwelled within its shadows. The atmosphere shifted suddenly. A faint hum began to resonate through the chamber, subtle at first, then growing steadily louder. The orb fragments on the altar began to vibrate softly, emitting a faint ethereal glow. The phosphorescent fungi clinging to the walls shimmered brighter, their light pulsating in rhythm with the humming. The voices came next, a chorus of whispers, barely audible, as though carried on the breath of the earth itself. They rose and fell in an eerie cadence, the spectral choir of the Silent Sisterhood awakening from its long slumber. A chill swept through the chamber, snuffing out several candles and plunging us into near darkness, save for the ghostly glow of the orb fragments and fungi. The coldness prickled my skin, as if unseen hands brushed against me, reminding me of the ancient forces at play. Holmes's voice cut through the gloom, calm and commanding. "Hold steady. The spirits are stirring." Then, as if summoned by Alira's chant and Holmes's determination, a figure materialized from the shadows, translucent yet unmistakably human in form. The apparition bore the solemn visage of a woman clad in the traditional habit of the Silent Sisterhood. Her eyes, vast pools of sorrow and fierce determination, fixed on Idris. It was Saren herself, the legendary founder of the Silent Sisterhood, bound eternally by her vow of silence, yet now granted a fleeting voice through the ritual. "You carry the bloodline," she whispered, voice like the rustling of dead leaves on a cold autumn night. "You are both heir and guardian of a legacy forged in sacrifice and silence." Holmes stepped forward, speaking with measured resolve. "Saren, we come seeking to restore the covenant and to quell the unrest that threatens not only this abbey, but the very fabric of the world beyond." The apparition's gaze shifted toward the pendant. "The sign must be whole. Only then may the silence be lifted without unraveling the bond. The balance is delicate. One wrong move could doom us all." Idris, kneeling beside the altar, raised the pendant over the scattered fragments of the orb. A sudden brilliance burst forth, a radiant light that bathed the chamber in warm golden hues. The fragments began to levitate, slowly drawing together with a hypnotic grace until the orb reformed, whole once more. The choir's spectral voices soared, no longer mournful but triumphant, weaving a tapestry of sound that filled the chamber and stirred even the stone walls to their ancient core. I felt tears prick my eyes as the tension that had gripped the abbey for so long began to lift. The air lightened, the coldness dissipated, and for the first time in many months, the silence felt sacred rather than suffocating. Saren's figure began to fade, her parting words a whisper carried on the returning breeze. "Remember, silence is not absence, but respect. The legacy of the Silent Sister is to listen beyond words and to speak with purpose when the time is right. Guard the balance, for it is fragile and must never be broken." As dawn painted the sky in hues of pink and gold, the abbey itself seemed transformed. The heavy shroud of mystery had lifted, replaced by a fragile hope. Holmes turned to me, his expression softer than I had seen in weeks. "Watson, the legacy of the Silent Sister teaches silence is a powerful tool, but it must never become a prison. Truth must find its voice in time." Alira's serene smile was the quiet affirmation of that truth. Idris Vaughn, clutching the pendant, spoke with renewed strength. "We are no longer bound by fear, but by responsibility. The abbey's future lies in balance, between silence and speech, secrecy and revelation." As we prepared to leave the abbey, the village of Langar seemed transformed as well. The villagers greeted us with cautious smiles, the shadows of fear and superstition replaced by something lighter, freer. The whispers on the wind had changed too, no longer ominous warnings, but songs of remembrance and renewal. Holmes and I exchanged a knowing glance, aware that though one mystery had ended, countless others awaited discovery in the hidden corners of the world. For in every silence lies a story yearning to be told, and in every sign, a secret longing to be unveiled. Chapter 15. The Echoes of Silence. The dawn had scarcely broken when Holmes and I found ourselves once again in the abbey's shadowed cloisters, the ancient stones bathed in the pale light of early morning. The events of the previous night still lingered in my mind like a vivid dream. The ritual's eerie brilliance, the apparition of Saren, and the fragile promise of peace that had followed. Yet beneath the calm surface, I sensed an undercurrent of unease. The silence that had once seemed oppressive now felt watchful, as if the abbey itself awaited a reckoning that had yet to come. Holmes, typically inscrutable, appeared unusually restless. He paced the length of the corridor, hands clasped behind his back, brow furrowed in thought. "Watson," he said abruptly, halting by a narrow window that looked out onto the mist-shrouded hills, "there is something we have overlooked." I turned to him, intrigued. "What is it?" "The abbey's silence is not merely a vow of the sisterhood," Holmes replied, "but a carefully maintained barrier, one that conceals more than just history." There are those within these walls who would see the past remain buried, no matter the cost. His eyes gleamed with conviction. The peace we restored is tenuous at best. Tonight's events have stirred forces we cannot yet comprehend. Our suspicions were soon confirmed. That afternoon, as the abbey's bells tolled for vespers, a series of disturbances rippled through the quiet halls. Strange noises, faint footsteps in empty corridors, whispers without speakers, unnerved the monks and villagers alike. Alira sought us out with urgent news. "There is talk of a gathering," she said, voice low. "A faction within the abbey opposes the restoration. They fear the ritual has weakened the silence's protection." Morrigan, ever the vigilant guardian, nodded grimly. The Silent Sisterhood's legacy is a double-edged sword. Some believe that breaking the silence invites ruin. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Then we must uncover who is behind this resistance and why. We spent the evening quietly investigating, our footsteps echoing against the stone as we moved through the labyrinthine corridors. The abbey's shadows seemed alive, whispering secrets just beyond our hearing. In the dim light of the scriptorium, Holmes examined an old manuscript, its margins inscribed with ominous annotations. "This," he said, pointing, "is a warning, an admonition against breaking the covenant. The author speaks of a watcher in the shadows, an agent of silence whose duty is to enforce the vow at any cost." I shuddered. "Enforce it by what means?" Holmes's expression darkened. "By whatever means necessary, Watson, including murder." That night, as the abbey lay cloaked in silence, we heard it. The soft, deliberate footsteps of someone moving through the halls. A shadow flitted past the doorway of our chamber, vanishing before we could react. Holmes's gaze was sharp as a blade. "They are watching us." We resolved to set a trap, gathering a few trusted allies, Alira, Morrigan, and Idris, to confront this invisible adversary. Our plan was simple but perilous. We would stake out the scriptorium, where the dissenters were rumored to meet, and catch them in the act of sabotage or conspiracy. As midnight approached, the abbey's corridors grew colder, the silence thickening like a living thing. Our group assembled quietly, concealed in the shadowed alcoves around the scriptorium door. Minutes passed like hours, the tension mounting with every breath. Then, a faint creak, a soft click of the latch, and the door eased open. A figure stepped inside, cloaked and hooded, moving with deliberate caution. Holmes signaled for us to remain silent as the figure approached the manuscripts spread upon the desk. With deft fingers, the intruder produced a knife, its blade catching the candlelight, and began slicing through the precious parchments. Holmes's hand shot out, grabbing the figure's wrist with iron strength. The cloak was yanked back to reveal a face I did not recognize, a woman, her eyes blazing with fanatic intensity. "You have no right," she hissed, struggling against Holmes's grip. "Who are you?" Holmes demanded, voice cold and commanding. "I am the keeper of the silence," she spat. "I guard the sacred vow. You threaten to undo centuries of protection with your reckless meddling." Her voice trembled with fervor, but beneath it lay desperation. Holmes regarded her steadily. "We seek not to undo, but to understand, to bring peace. Your actions only endanger all." The woman's resolve wavered, but then she spat again. "The silence is the only shield against chaos. Break it, and you invite destruction." Alira stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "The silence must never be a prison. It must serve those who live within it, not enslave them." The keeper's eyes flickered, torn between hatred and hope. Suddenly, the door burst open. A group of monks flooded the room, faces a mixture of shock and suspicion. The keeper's grip tightened on the knife. "You will regret this," she warned before turning and fleeing into the night. Holmes clenched his jaw. She will not give up easily. In the days that followed, tensions escalated. The abbey was divided, the fragile peace shattered by fear and suspicion. Yet Holmes remained resolute. "We must press on, Watson. The true battle lies ahead, to confront the forces that would silence truth itself." As night fell, we prepared for what promised to be the final confrontation. The echo of silence reverberating through the abbey's ancient stones. The tension in the abbey was palpable as the keeper of the silence's warning echoed through my mind. The calm that had followed the ritual was now shattered, replaced by a tempest of fear and suspicion that churned beneath the surface like a gathering storm. Holmes and I sat in the scriptorium, the flickering candlelight casting our elongated shadows upon the ancient manuscripts sprawled across the heavy oak table. Idris, Alira, and Morrigan had dispersed to rally the few monks and villagers who still trusted us, for it was clear the abbey was fracturing along lines of loyalty and fear. Holmes leaned close to me, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Watson, the keeper's fanaticism is but a symptom of a greater malaise. There are secrets buried deeper than even this ancient order understands." I nodded, sensing the gravity of his words. "What do you propose?" Holmes tapped a finger against a dusty volume. "We must seek the hidden chamber I glimpsed in the catacombs yesterday, the one marked with the obscure symbols. I suspect it holds the key to this entire mystery." We ventured back into the labyrinthine catacombs beneath the abbey, the narrow passages damp and reeking of earth and mold. The air grew colder with every step, thick with the silence of centuries. Idris led the way, his lantern casting eerie light on walls etched with faded glyphs and forgotten prayers. The signs Holmes had noticed, a twisting serpent intertwined with a silent bell, guided us deeper into the bowels of the abbey. At last, we came upon a heavy stone door, its surface carved with the same symbols. Holmes traced the patterns with his fingers, murmuring softly. "It is a seal," he said, "one that binds something powerful within." With a combined effort, we pushed the door open, revealing a small chamber lined with ancient scrolls, bones, and relics. But what caught my eye was a crudely drawn map, pinned to the far wall, annotated with cryptic marks and warnings. Holmes examined the map intently. "This chart appears to detail a network of tunnels extending beyond the abbey grounds, possibly escape routes or secret meeting places." Alira's eyes widened. The resistance must be using these passages to move unseen. A sudden noise interrupted our study, a faint scratching, like nails against stone. We exchanged tense glances before Holmes motioned us to silence. From the shadows emerged a figure, cloaked and silent, yet unmistakably human. It was the keeper of the silence. Her expression was one of bitter resolve. "You trespass where you should not," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of conviction. Holmes stepped forward. "We seek truth, not conflict. There is more at stake here than old vows and fear." The keeper shook her head. "Truth is a dangerous thing when wielded by those who do not understand its cost." She pulled from her cloak an ancient dagger, its blade inscribed with runes. "I have sworn to protect the silence. If that means standing against you, so be it." The chamber's shadows seemed to lengthen as she advanced, dagger raised. Holmes was swift, disarming her with a deft movement. The dagger clattered to the floor, but the fire in her eyes did not waver. "You are not our enemy," Holmes said quietly. "But there are forces here that threaten us all, forces that even you cannot control." The keeper's breath came fast, torn between anger and a dawning understanding. Before we could press further, a loud rumble shook the chamber, dust falling from the ceiling. Outside, the abbey's ancient stones groaned, as if warning of a cataclysm to come. We hurried back to the surface, urgency propelling us through the twisting corridors. The monks and villagers had gathered in the great hall, their faces etched with fear. Holmes addressed the assembly. "The silence must not be a prison. It is a covenant to protect, yes, but also to enlighten. There are those among us who seek to use it as a weapon." Idris stepped forward. "We must stand united, or the abbey will fall to darkness." Alira's voice rang out, clear and commanding. "The true enemy is not the silence itself, but those who would wield it to divide us." As night deepened, the abbey settled into a tense vigil. Guards were posted, and the tunnels sealed where possible, yet the feeling of being watched lingered like a cold breath upon our necks. Holmes and I sat in quiet contemplation, the weight of the coming confrontation heavy upon us. "Tomorrow," Holmes said at last, "we face the heart of this darkness. The echoes of silence are loudest just before the storm." The abbey had never felt more claustrophobic. Its ancient walls, which had once offered sanctuary and solemn refuge, now seemed to close in like the very jaws of a trap. The flickering candlelight in the great hall cast long shadows across faces drawn tight with anxiety, and the oppressive silence between words was deafening. Holmes and I sat near the hearth, the only source of warmth in the vast chamber. His gaze was fixed on the dancing flames, fingers steepled beneath his chin. For the first time, I saw a vulnerability there, a a recognition of the grave stakes we faced. Elira, Morrigan, and Idris are coordinating the defenses, Holmes murmured. The Keeper's faction grows bolder. Tonight, I fear, will be decisive. I felt the chill of foreboding creep along my spine. The Abbey's fate, and perhaps far more, hung in the balance. The hours before midnight dragged on with agonizing slowness. The monks and villagers moved silently, a ghostly procession of wary eyes and whispered prayers. It was as if the Abbey itself braced for a storm it could neither control nor escape. Holmes had asked me to keep watch by the East Wing corridor, where several secret passages converged. I was to signal at the first sign of trouble. At length, a faint stirring reached my ears, the soft shuffle of footsteps too cautious to be anything but deliberate. My heart quickened. Through the gloom, a figure emerged, a monk, hood drawn low, moving with stealth. I stepped forward, voice firm but low. "Who goes there?" The figure froze, then lowered his hood to reveal a young man's face, pale and determined. "I come with a warning," he whispered. "The Keeper's faction plans to seize the ritual chamber tonight. They believe controlling the sign will grant them power beyond reckoning." I hastened to inform Holmes, who immediately gathered our small band of allies. We armed ourselves not with swords or pistols, but with knowledge, courage, and the fragile hope that reason might prevail. As the Abbey's bells tolled midnight, we moved as one toward the ritual chamber, every nerve taut with anticipation. The heavy oak doors loomed ahead, carved with the serpent and bell symbol, silent sentinels guarding the secrets within. Holmes exchanged a glance with Elira. "This is the crucible," he said quietly. "What we do here will echo for generations." We entered the chamber to find the Keeper's faction already assembled, hooded figures muttering incantations and brandishing relics pulsating with dark energy. The air thickened with menace, the very shadows twisting into shapes of malice. Holmes stepped forward, voice ringing out with authority. "This ends now. The sign belongs not to the fearful or the fanatical, but to the Abbey and to truth." The Keeper herself emerged from the crowd, eyes blazing. "You would condemn us to silence and subjugation. The sign is a weapon, a shield. We will wield it or we will destroy it." A tense standoff ensued, words exchanged like blows, each faction rooted in their belief that theirs was the righteous path. Suddenly, a surge of energy erupted from the pendant, bathing the chamber in an unearthly light. The orb fragments, once reassembled, shimmered and hummed, resonating with the ancient power of the Silent Sisterhood. Holmes moved swiftly, reciting the counter-incantations we had painstakingly pieced together from the manuscripts. The light intensified, blinding and pure. In that moment, I glimpsed the truth beyond words. The sign was not a weapon nor a prison, but a bridge. A bridge between silence and speech, between past and present, between fear and hope. The Keeper faltered, her resolve cracking as the power washed over her. With a final cry, she dropped her relic, collapsing to her knees. Holmes extended a hand, steady and compassionate. "The silence is not to be feared but respected. It must serve those it binds, not enslave them." The faction's resistance dissolved like mist under the dawn's first light. The Abbey exhaled, releasing centuries of held breath. Idris approached, the pendant gleaming softly in his palm. "The covenant is renewed. The Abbey's future, though uncertain, is now ours to shape." Elira's smile was weary but genuine. The silence is no longer a shackle but a sanctuary. As dawn broke over the Welsh hills, Holmes and I stood outside the Abbey, the cool morning air cleansing the shadows of night. Holmes turned to me, a rare softness in his eyes. "Watson, in the echoes of silence, we find not absence, but profound presence. The greatest mysteries are not always solved by words, but by listening beyond them." I nodded, grateful for the lessons learned and the mysteries yet to unfold. For the Abbey, and for us, the sign of the Silent Sister was both an ending and a beginning. Chapter 16, The Last Silence. The morning mist clung to the Welsh hills like a lingering secret as Holmes and I prepared to leave the Abbey behind. Yet despite the dawn's gentle light, a heaviness settled over me, a premonition that our journey was not quite complete. Holmes, ever perceptive, caught my glance. "There is one last truth to unearth, Watson," he said quietly, the final silence yet to be broken. We retraced our steps to the Abbey's inner sanctum, the chamber where the sign had revealed its power and its peril. The air was thick with the scent of incense and old stone. a sacred stillness wrapping around us. Holmes carefully examined the now dormant pendant. Its once luminous glow faded, but its power palpable beneath the surface. "Something remains hidden in this artifact," he murmured. "A cipher, a secret message embedded in its very design." Drawing upon his encyclopedic knowledge of cryptography and ancient languages, Holmes began a painstaking process of analysis, comparing the runes to the Abbey's manuscripts and the whispered legends we had collected. Hours passed. The sun arced across the sky, yet Holmes did not waver, his concentration absolute. Finally, he sat back, eyes gleaming with triumph. "The pendant is not merely a symbol, but a key to a hidden chamber beneath the Abbey's foundation." We descended into the crypts once more, the flickering torchlight revealing passages yet unexplored. Holmes led the way to a wall inscribed with the serpent and bell, now revealed as a cleverly concealed door. With a press and a click, the stone shifted, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a small chamber, its walls lined with ancient scrolls and relics untouched by time. In the center lay a sarcophagus, carved with the likeness of a nun, her face serene, her eyes closed in eternal silence. Holmes approached with reverence. "This is the Silent Sister herself, the founder of the vow and the keeper of the original secret." Carefully, he traced a hidden inscription on the sarcophagus's edge. The true purpose of the silence was to protect knowledge too dangerous for the world above, Holmes explained. Not to imprison, but to shield. The room suddenly felt alive with presence about, as if the past spoke through the very stones. Holmes found a compartment within the sarcophagus, revealing a faded journal, the Silent Sister's own words. Reading aloud, he translated passages of love, sacrifice, and the burden of a secret too terrible to share. "The vow of silence was a shield against tyranny," Holmes said softly, "against those who would twist knowledge into weaponry." It dawned on me. The keeper's fanaticism, the division within the Abbey, the ritual itself, all stemmed from this ancient fear. Holmes closed the journal gently. The real threat was not the breaking of silence, but the misuse of what silence concealed. As we ascended back into daylight, the Abbey seemed transformed, no longer a place of fear, but of cautious hope. Holmes turned to me, a rare smile flickering. "Watson, the greatest mysteries are not those of murder or theft, but of human spirit, its capacity for silence, for sacrifice, and for redemption." I could only nod, filled with gratitude for having witnessed such a profound journey. Before we departed, the Abbey's inhabitants gathered to renew their vow, not as a silence imposed, but as a solemn promise freely chosen. Alira approached us, eyes shining. "You have restored more than peace. You have restored voice to the voiceless." Holmes bowed slightly, and reminded us all that silence, when understood, speaks volumes. As we rode away from the monastery, the Welsh landscape stretching vast and wild before us, I reflected on the echoes of the Silent Sister's story. In a world too often filled with noise and haste, there lies a power in quiet understanding, in listening to what is not said, and in honoring the secrets that shape us. Epilogue: Whispers Beyond the Silence. Weeks had passed since our departure from the remote abbey nestled in the Welsh hills. London's fog felt heavier than ever, its endless bustle a stark contrast to the serene yet somber silence we had left behind. Holmes sat in his armchair by the window of 221B Baker Street, fingers lightly drumming on the armrest as he gazed absently at the swirling London mist. I entered, carrying a parcel tied with string, the journal of the Silent Sister, entrusted to us by Alira herself. "Holmes," I said softly, placing the journal on the table. "The story we uncovered, it lingers." "A testament to the power and peril of silence," he nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, Watson, silence is rarely empty. It is a vessel for truth, for memory, and sometimes for lies." Opening the journal once more, Holmes's eyes caught a small folded note tucked between the fragile pages. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a cryptic inscription in an ancient script. "It seems," Holmes murmured, "that even in Revelation, some mysteries endure." I leaned closer as he translated. "Not all voices need sound. Some speak through silence profound. The final truth remains concealed until the heart is truly healed." Holmes looked up, a faint smile playing on his lips. The Silent Sister has left us a riddle, a challenge, perhaps, for another time. Outside, the city's clamor rose anew. But within 221B, a quiet understanding settled between us. The echoes of silence were far from over. Thank you so much for listening to our Honoring Audiobooks original Sherlock Holmes adventure. We hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to leave a comment letting us know which story you'd like to hear next and where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our detective fans around the world. See you in the next adventure.